One child would grow to hunt the hunters and become the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter. But his story did not begin with a weapon. It began with a man who wanted something no amount of credits could buy. 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Republic was preparing for war, a conflict not yet seen but already inevitable. And on the distant ocean world of Kamino, the first soldiers were being grown. An army, fast, obedient, identical. The Kaminoans had perfected a method of cloning from a single source, a man whose skills had no equal in the Outer Rim. Jango Fett, Mandalorian mercenary, hunter of Jedi. The most dangerous man the galaxy could buy. The Republic offered him more wealth than most would see in 10 lifetimes. In exchange, he would become the genetic template for an entire clone army. But Jango Fett had one condition, one that surprised even the Kaminoans. He wanted a son, not a squad, not a battalion, a single child, an unaltered clone, free from the growth acceleration, free from the behavioral programming, free to grow as nature intended. The Kaminoans were confused. Why want one child when you could have 1,000,000 copies? Jango never answered with emotion. He only gave a name, Boba. And so they made him. Boba Fett was not born. He was manufactured, not in blood, but in liquid, not in love, but in silence. He opened his eyes in a vat of amniotic fluid, on a world where rain never stopped falling. There was no mother to hold him, only cold hands and data pads. But Jango kept his promise. He didn't treat Boba like an experiment. He treated him like a son. Boba didn't know what Kamino was. To him, it was just home. Metal corridors, black water, the steady hum of generators beneath endless storm clouds, and above all, the clones. Thousands of them, marching in perfect rhythm, training with the same expression, eating at the same time. Each one shared his face, but none shared his life. They looked like brothers, but they were not allowed to be. Boba had no unit designation, no inhibitor chip, no numbers stamped onto his neck. He was not made to fight the Republic's war. He was made for Jango's war. In private, his father taught him how to load a blaster, how to fire without blinking, how to speak only when necessary. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting ones, when Jango was something else. He would place his gloves aside and talk to Boba over a meal, tell stories of Concord Dawn, of battles long forgotten. And sometimes, he would laugh. Boba remembered those moments, because they never lasted. Every week, his father would disappear. Kamino would fall quieter than usual. And when Jango returned, he always brought the smell of carbon scoring and scorched fabric. The boy never asked where he went. He knew better than to question the galaxy's most dangerous man. Still, he noticed the bruises, the way Jango moved slower each time he came back, the silence in his eyes that grew heavier with every mission. Something was changing, not just in his father, but in Kamino itself. New ships arrived, Republic envoys, Jedi generals. The clone production lines doubled in speed, and the word war began to echo in the Kaminoan halls, soft at first, then louder. Boba didn't understand what was coming. He only knew his father was preparing for something he wouldn't speak of. And then one day, it happened. Jango returned to their quarters with 2 words. Pack up. They were leaving Kamino. Destination, Geonosis. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Boba could see it in his eyes. Something was coming, and it would change everything. Kamino was quiet when they returned. Too quiet. Even the rain seemed slower, as if the sky itself knew what had been lost. Geonosis had changed everything. For the Republic, for the Jedi. And for one boy, now standing in a hangar that no longer felt like home, he came back alone. Jango Fett, the most dangerous man in the galaxy, was gone. Not in legend, not in memory, but in the worst way possible. He had died in the dirt, in front of his son, beheaded by a Jedi Knight whose name would be whispered in Boba's mind for the rest of his life. Mace Windu. There had been no chance to say goodbye, no time to scream. Only a helmet, still warm from the battle, resting on sand soaked in shadows. Boba didn't speak during the journey back. He didn't cry. He didn't sleep. Inside, Slave One, the silence grew louder. And when the ship landed, the Kaminoans offered no words, just datapads, reports, instructions on what to do next. But Boba didn't follow instructions anymore. The boy who once roamed these halls with wonder now walked like a ghost. The same face as the others, but something missing behind the eyes. The cloning facilities carried on without pause. Troopers marched in perfect step. Training cadets shouted orders in time with rising alarms. The Republic's war machine had no room for grief. And Boba had nowhere left to belong. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a cadet. He wasn't even considered valuable anymore. To the Kaminoans, his purpose had died with Jango. To the clones, he was something strange. Not a brother, not a superior. Just a mirror that refused to break. He tried to retrace old steps. The mess hall where Jango once corrected his posture. The shooting range where his father taught him the pressure point of a trigger. The platform where they used to watch the storms together. But everything felt wrong. As if the entire world had moved on without him. Even the armor was gone. Recovered by the Jedi. Locked away somewhere on Coruscant far beyond his reach. All he had left was the ship. And the voice, Jango's voice, preserved in a few last recordings. Short commands, old messages, instructions for a future that would never come. Boba listened to them every night, not for guidance, but because it was the only voice that still knew his name. The Republic never came to find him. The Jedi never asked what happened to the boy. No one filed a report. And so, Boba Fett disappeared into the very place he was created. In the shadows of Kamino, among the soldiers who didn't know him, a boy without purpose began to build one. He wasn't old enough to hold rank, but old enough to remember. He wasn't strong enough to fight yet, but strong enough to hate. And in that silence, hate began to grow. It began in fire, and it ended in silence. The first battle of the Clone Wars, fought on the Red Plains of Geonosis, was meant to be a show of power, a warning to separatists, a declaration from the Republic. But for one boy, it was something else. It was the day the galaxy ended. They arrived under the cover of dust. Slave Eye descended onto the surface like a predator returning to familiar prey. Boba didn't know what the mission truly was. Only that his father had prepared differently this time. Jango had polished his armor twice, checked his weapons 4 times. And for the first time since Kamino, his voice had changed. Colder, distant, tired. Boba had seen him come home from wounds before, but he had never seen him look like this, as if he already knew. The Geonosian arena was chaos. Hundreds of Jedi, columns of droids, blast of fire turning sand into smoke. Boba watched from the shadows of the upper deck. No helmet, no protection. Just the sound of his father's jetpack echoing below, a glint of silver in a storm of death. And then, the moment. It happened fast. Too fast. A flash of purple light, a roar, a sudden silence. Jango fell without a word. His body slammed against the dirt. His head rolled seconds later. The crowd kept screaming. The battle kept going. But to Boba, the world had stopped. He didn't cry out, didn't run, he walked, step by step, down into the arena. While Jedi fought and droids exploded, he moved like someone in a dream, as if hoping that by the time he reached the body, it wouldn't be real. But it was. The armor was there, damaged, cracked, burnt, and beside it, the helmet, still warm. He picked it up with both hands, held it close, and stared into the emptiness where his father's eyes used to be. There was no blood, no last breath, just the sound of war growing around him, a noise he no longer heard. Some say he stood there for minutes. Others say hours. No one approached him, not the clones, not the Jedi, not even Mace Windu, who turned and walked away, never looking back. When it was over, Boba climbed back into the ship alone. He didn't take the body. He didn't take anything, except the helmet. He sat in the pilot's chair, feet too short to reach the pedals, and waited until the sun set. He didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't move. In that moment, something inside him fractured, not like glass, but like ice, quiet, invisible, permanent. Boba Fett died that day too. Not his body, not his name, but the part of him that trusted the galaxy to be fair. He had seen war. He had seen the Jedi. He had seen what justice looked like, and it looked like silence. That was the last time he ever saw Geonosis. But Geonosis never left him. Every bounty he hunted, every mark he tracked, every shot he fired, it all started here. In the dirt, in the blood, in the moment where a son stood over a fallen father and said nothing. He didn't wear it at first. The helmet sat beside him in the ship for days, motionless, quiet, heavy in ways he didn't understand yet. It still smelled like his father. Burnt leather, gun oil, cold iron. Boba didn't speak to anyone, didn't respond to transmissions. The Kaminoans assumed he was just in shock, that he'd come back when the systems failed or the hunger set in. But Boba Fett was already learning something no child should have to learn: how to be alone. Inside the ship, the lights stayed dim. He played the old training recordings just to hear his father's voice. Not because he needed to practice, but because it was the only thing that hadn't left him. Jango's voice said the same things it always did. Tighten your grip. Watch the wind. Don't aim. Predict. They were instructions, lessons, warnings. But to Boba, they were something else now. They were memories. Each one was a piece of the man he had lost, and each one hurt more than the last. He replayed the arena over and over in his mind. The flash of the lightsaber, the sudden fall, the way Jango didn't scream, didn't even try to crawl. It was supposed to be impossible. His father was the strongest man in the galaxy, but even the strongest men can't outrun fate. When the rations ran out, Boba didn't care. He sat on the floor, helmet in his lap, tracing the scratches in the visor. Each one told a story, a mission, a fight, a life. And now that life was gone, he could have left Kamino, started over on a different planet, lived quietly as someone else. But that wasn't who Jango raised. That wasn't who Boba was. One morning, or maybe it was night, he had lost track. He picked up the helmet again. This time, he didn't just hold it, he put it on. The weight settled over him like a second skin. It was too big, the visor too wide, the echo inside too loud. But he kept it on, not for protection, not for fear, because it was all he had left. The galaxy would never call him an orphan. They would call him a clone, a bounty hunter, a killer. But they would never see the boy underneath the helmet. And that was the point. In the mirror, he looked like Jango. Same armor, same glare, same silence. But the eyes didn't match. Jango's eyes had been focused, sharp, cold. Boba's were hollow. Kamino meant nothing to him now. Its halls were just steel and silence. Its clones were strangers, so he left. No goodbyes, no destination, just the ship, the helmet, and a promise whispered in his own mind. I will never forget. Not the Jedi who killed him, not the Republic who used him, not the world that created him and then cast him aside. From now on, Boba Fett would carry only what he needed: weapons, silence, memory, and a helmet that never came off again. Because beneath it, there was nothing left to protect, only the shadow of a boy who once had a father and now had a name the galaxy would never forget. The war had begun. Across the stars, clone troopers marched into battle. Jedi stood at the front of legions. Flags were raised, planets changed hands, and the galaxy held its breath. But behind all of it was a child, unclaimed, unspoken for, unseen. Boba Fett had returned from Geonosis with no father, no home, and no purpose. And the Republic didn't notice. Not the Jedi, not the Senate, not even Kamino. He was never entered into the database. No search was launched, no orders given. His name never appeared on a single datapad, because to them, he was no one. Just a copy, just another face in the millions. But he wasn't like them. He didn't march. He didn't obey. He remembered, and memory was all he had left. In the shadows of abandoned ports and forgotten hangars, Boba Fett began to live like a ghost, not hunted, but ignored. He scavenged what was left of Jango's gear, took what he could from old contracts, and taught himself how to survive in a galaxy that no longer cared. At first, he stayed near Kamino, as if hoping something would change, as if someone would realize he was still out there. But nothing came. The Jedi had moved on. The clones kept training, and the name Jango Fett was already being rewritten, spoken now as template, not man. So Boba drifted, from sector to sector, outposts, refueling stations, asteroid colonies, each place colder than the last. He kept his head down, listened more than he spoke, learned how credits moved, how men lied, how death could be traded like currency. He wasn't a bounty hunter yet, not truly, but he was already watching them, sitting in cantinas, memorizing names, studying how they walked, how they bartered, how they killed, and always comparing them to his father. None of them came close. Some recognized his face, tried to pull rank, tried to give orders. He ignored them. Others tried to manipulate him, promised contracts, training, revenge. He ignored them too. The only offer he accepted was silence. Because Boba Fett wasn't looking for a place to belong. He had tried that once. It died in the Geonosian sand. What he needed now was time. Time to understand who he was without Jango. Time to feel the pain without falling apart. Time to decide what kind of name Fett was going to become. He didn't stay in one place long. Never more than a week. Sometimes a day. He slept in vents, stole rations when he had to. Took small jobs when he could, deliveries, surveillance, dirty cleanup. He wasn't noticed. And that was exactly what he wanted, because attention meant risk, and risk meant weakness. He told no one his name, used old code names from Jango's files. Answers changed depending on the planet. But the helmet, he never removed it, even when it didn't fit, even when the visor blurred, even when the edges pressed against his skin in his sleep. It stayed on. Because it wasn't armor anymore. It was memory, and he would rather live in memory than face what came next. He learned how to disappear, not through the Force, not through tricks, but through stillness. Boba Fett became a shadow long before he became a hunter, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. The galaxy was not built for children without names, and it had no patience for grief. He scavenged in forgotten alleys, waited near garbage chutes, traced the outlines of blaster fire on old walls to map who had been killed and when. Sometimes he found the bodies. Sometimes he found the ones who left them behind. He studied both. The underworld didn't welcome him. It ignored him until it needed him. He was small enough to crawl into places grown men couldn't fit, fast enough to deliver messages through dangerous corridors, quiet enough to overhear things others weren't meant to hear. He wasn't trusted, but he was useful. And in the underworld, that was enough. At night, he stayed close to the ship. Slave Eye was the last piece of Jango that hadn't been taken. He couldn't fly it far, not without alerts, not without attention, but he could sleep inside. He could sit in the cockpit and pretend the galaxy outside didn't exist. He could replay the voice logs, one line at a time. If it jams, switch to manual. Don't let the client see your eyes. Always finish the job. They weren't bedtime stories. They weren't soft, but they were his, and he clung to them like air. The helmet stayed on, even when others mocked him for it, even when he bled underneath it, even when he woke in the dark, gasping for breath. He kept it on, because the pain underneath was still smaller than the emptiness without it. He didn't kill at first. He wasn't ready. Not because he lacked the skill, Jango had made sure of that, but because part of him still remembered what it felt like to be human. That part faded quickly. The first time was a man who tried to take the ship. He didn't know Boba was watching from above, didn't know the alarm system had been rigged, didn't expect a boy with a vibroblade to fall from the rafters like a shadow. It was quick, no anger, no words. Just instinct. Afterward, Boba sat in the same place for hours, staring at the blood, waiting for guilt, waiting for anything, but nothing came. He cleaned the blade, fixed the alarm, and slept in the same spot that night. That was how it began. Not with a scream, not with revenge, but with stillness. The others started to notice. "Fett's kid," they whispered. The ghost boy. The quiet one with the eyes. He didn't correct them. Didn't speak unless spoken to. Didn't beg. Didn't bluff. And that made him dangerous. Because in the underworld, the ones who talk the least usually bleed the least. He didn't want to become a killer. He just didn't want to be weak. And slowly, that was enough. The fires inside him didn't burn hot. They smoldered, cold, slow, patient. Every job he took sharpened him. Every betrayal taught him how to spot the next one. Every scar reminded him what the galaxy does to the unprepared. He wasn't chasing credits. He wasn't chasing glory. He was building something, layer by layer, move by move. And soon, he would no longer be the child in the shadows. He would become the thing others feared in them. He didn't find a family. He found a circle of ghosts. Men and women who had already lost too much to care what someone else had lost. They didn't ask his name, didn't ask where he came from, because in the underworld, everyone was running from something. He met them one by one, not all at once. The galaxy didn't work that cleanly. Bosk, the cold-blooded hunter with eyes that never blinked. Aurra Sing, all bone and shadow with a voice that cracked like lightning. Castus, Lats, Dengar. Broken names, fractured loyalties. Each one dangerous, each one alone. Until survival pushed them into the same airlock. They called themselves bounty hunters, but they weren't chasing criminals. They were chasing breath, day by day, kill by kill. Boba didn't belong there. Not yet, but they didn't push him away. They saw something useful. something quiet, something they could mold. At first, they laughed when he spoke. His voice hadn't dropped yet. His armor didn't fit. His silence wasn't intimidating, it was just strange. But then they watched him work. They saw how he tracked faster than they could, how he noticed things others missed, how he learned entire syndicate routes in a single day, memorizing facial patterns and cargo manifests like puzzles. They stopped laughing and started watching. Aura taught him how to lie without blinking, how to disarm a man without drawing a weapon, how to spot fear before a blaster is pulled. Bosk showed him how to track by scent, how to mask your presence with the wind, how to kill clean. But they didn't treat him like family. They weren't parents. They were survivors, and they only taught him because he could be useful. Boba understood. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for sharp edges, things he could use, things that made him forget what it felt like to be small. Sometimes, they tested him, left him behind on a job, fed him false coordinates to see if he'd fall into a trap. He didn't. Other times, they tried to push him too far, asked him to kill civilians, sabotage allies, lie in ways that felt too close to becoming something else. He refused, quietly, without drama, and that confused them. Because Boba Fett was learning how to be dangerous, but he still hadn't let the galaxy change his rules. Not yet. He watched the others closely, how they drank to silence the screams, how they smiled when someone weaker was punished, how none of them ever looked each other in the eyes for more than a second. He realized something in those long silences between missions. They weren't just hunters. They were the hunted. Not by bounty pucks, not by contracts, by their pasts, by the versions of themselves they left behind and couldn't outrun. It made him wonder, was he one of them now? Had he crossed some line without knowing? He stared into the mirror in the ship one night, helmet off, face pale, eyes darker than they should have been. He looked like every other clone, but he didn't feel like any of them. He didn't belong to the Republic. He didn't belong to Jango anymore. He didn't even belong to these mercenaries. So where did he belong? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. As long as he stayed with them, he wouldn't be the weakest one in the room. And in this galaxy, that was the only rule that mattered. The boy was fading, not from sight, from being. Every day, a little less of him remained. A little less of the child who once waited in the rain on Camino. A little less of the voice that called out for his father. The others didn't notice. Or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. In the underworld, no one asked who you were, only what you could do. And Boba Fett could do almost anything. He was still small, still young, but his silence filled rooms larger men avoided. He could stand beside seasoned killers and never flinch. He could watch a man beg for mercy and feel nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, nothing at all. That was the difference. He didn't become ruthless. He became empty. There was no cruelty in his actions, only precision. No emotion, only efficiency. He spoke when needed, acted when told, and learned faster than anyone else. And as his skills grew, so did the whispers. That's Fett's boy. The clone who doesn't sleep. The one who never misses. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was blessed. Boba didn't correct them. He didn't care what they called him, only that they remembered. He began taking smaller contracts alone. On Nar Shaddaa, Corellia, even Ord Mantell. Simple targets at first, smugglers, deserters, debtors. Every job completed, every mark found. He didn't chase the thrill of killing. He chased the feeling afterward, the quiet, the stillness, the one moment where the galaxy finally stopped moving long enough for him to breathe. Sometimes, when he was alone in the ship, he would remove the helmet, just to see what remained. His reflection was the same, but the eyes were older, harder, like time itself had decided to skip ahead. He didn't recognize himself anymore, and that was the point. The helmet went back on. Every time. Faster than before. He spoke less, slept less, ate only when necessary. His voice deepened, but not with age, with exhaustion. Even the others started to notice the distance. Bossk stopped trying to teach him. Aura stopped asking questions. Dengar started avoiding eye contact altogether. The child was gone. What stood among them was something colder. One night, in the quiet between contracts, he took the ship and left without a word. No message, no farewell. He didn't owe them that. They had given him what he needed and nothing more. The stars stretched endlessly before him. Black, silent, familiar. He didn't set a course, he just flew. Hours, maybe days, until the nav system began to blur from overuse. He didn't care. He wasn't running anymore, and he wasn't searching either. He was simply existing, drifting through the void in armor that no longer belonged to a father. It belonged to him now. Somewhere between the blaster fire and betrayal, between the hunts and the hollow victories, the boy had vanished, and the galaxy had gained a name: Boba Fett. Not the son of Jango, not the orphan of Kamino, not the lost child of the war, just Boba Fett. He had no home, no master, no cause, only purpose. He didn't hate the Jedi anymore, didn't love his father less, didn't fear what he was becoming. He just accepted it. Because in a galaxy built on war and betrayal, survival was the only truth that mattered. And survival had no room for innocence. The child was gone. All that remained was the armor, the silence, and the man who would never take either off again. They didn't welcome him, they didn't reject him either. He just showed up one day and stayed. Boba Fett was still young, too young. But the underworld didn't care about years. It only cared about usefulness. He knew how to move without sound, how to study patterns, how to slip between shadows and leave no trail. He could disarm a man twice his size, or go unnoticed in a room full of killers. That was enough. He found them scattered across the rim. Wounded names, half-legends, hunters whose reputations were sharper than their reflexes. Bossk, tall, patient, and cold. A Trandoshan who smelled blood before it was spilled. He didn't speak much, but when he looked at you, you felt it. Like being sized for a coffin. Aura sing faster than rumor. All white skin and sunken eyes. She didn't laugh. She didn't blink. And the moment you turned your back, she already knew your weakness. Castus, Cato Parasiti, Lats Ratzi. Names whispered in bounty circles, cursed in criminal dens. They weren't family. They weren't friends. They were monsters. And Boba stood among them. He wasn't like them, not yet. But he watched, always watched. At first, they gave him the smallest roles. Scout, decoy, tech handler. They didn't trust him with kills, didn't give him real credits, only the scraps, and he took them. No complaints, no pride, because every scrap was a lesson. Every insult, a chance to stay longer. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't ask for favors, didn't show weakness. He was learning not just how to survive, but how to read people. He learned what kind of lies made hunters feel important, what kind of silences made them nervous, what kind of wounds made them remember the past. He stored it all. Bossk taught with action. Aura taught with threat. Castas taught with betrayal. And Boba learned from all of them. He watched how they negotiated bounties, watched how they marked exits before drawing weapons, watched how they buried regret under layers of sarcasm and silence. He didn't admire them. He didn't envy them, but he understood why they were still alive, because they had become exactly what the galaxy needed them to be. Monsters. He knew that word well. He had heard it once, whispered about his father, by a senator, by a clone trainer, even once by a Jedi. But Jango had never been a monster. He had been sharp, clean, precise, a blade used by others but never dull. Boba still remembered his voice, still played the recordings, still whispered the old advice under his breath before every mission. But he never told the others. He never spoke Jango's name around them, because they wouldn't understand. They didn't believe in fathers or legacy, only in violence. He was surrounded by killers, each one with a story they refused to tell, each one with eyes that didn't blink the way normal people did. And now, he was becoming one of them, not through initiation, not through a title, through silence, through repetition, through the way he began to see people not as lives, but as obstacles. The galaxy didn't offer him peace. It didn't offer him justice. It offered him monsters, and the chance to learn how to become one before something worse came to find him. The training never stopped. It just changed shape. In the old days it had rules. Kamino's firing ranges, timed courses, simulated targets. Now, it was real. Every shot could mean death. Every mistake was permanent. And every lesson left something behind: a bruise, a scar, a memory too sharp to fade. They didn't teach him through instruction. They taught through consequence. Bosk dropped him on a jungle moon once. No map, no food, no beacon. "Survive 5 days," was all he said, and left. It rained the first 2 nights. He slipped on rock, split his hand open. No medical kit, just dirt, sweat, and instinct. He tracked a local predator by its scent, not to kill it, but to follow its trail to a watering hole. It worked. On the 5th morning, Bosk returned. Didn't speak, just nodded once. That was how approval looked. Aurra Singh was different. She preferred silence over instruction. But when she did speak, the words cut deep. "Don't hesitate. Ever. Mercy is weakness. Everyone lies, especially the ones closest to you." She once gave him a test. A senator's aide, wanted for embezzlement, unarmed, barely 30 years old. Boba tracked him, cornered him, watched the man beg, and let him go. Aurra said nothing, just watched. That night, she told the others, Boba failed the test, and left him off the next job. The message was clear. Killing wasn't about justice. It was about commitment. So the next time, he didn't hesitate. The targets began to blur. Some were armed. Some weren't. Some deserved it. Some didn't. But Boba stopped asking questions. He learned to study profiles, not personalities. Eyes on the bounty, not the story. Because stories got you killed. Castas was the worst teacher. Not because he was cruel, because he was cowardly. He'd abandon partners mid-job, redirect shots, fabricate reports to earn more credits. And Boba watched it all. One mission on Felucia, Castas blamed him for a failed pickup. The client docked their pay. Aurra was furious. Boba didn't argue, didn't complain. But he remembered. He tracked Castas's messages, read the edited logs, heard the truth, and stored it like a weapon. He wasn't ready to use it yet. But one day, he would be. Because that was another lesson the monsters taught him. Patience. They all fought differently. Bosk with brute force, Aurra with speed, Castas with deception. Boba didn't match any of them. He wasn't the strongest, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the loudest. But he was precise, and that made him dangerous. He could break a lock in seconds. Jam a transmission mid-sentence. Fire once and never miss. He didn't brag, didn't gloat, didn't look for praise, because he wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it to forget. Each mission, each bounty, each silent kill away to burn away the voice in his head. The voice that still remembered Camino. The voice that still whispered Jango's words. The voice that still asked what he was becoming. But it was getting quieter now. He didn't flinch anymore. Didn't hesitate. Didn't ask for anyone's approval. He just worked and watched. Watched how monsters lived. Watched how they justified every choice. Watched how none of them ever slept through the night. And slowly, he started to understand something terrifying. He was getting better at this. Not just the skills, the silence, the empty feeling after. It no longer felt wrong. It felt normal. The helmet never left his side. In the beginning, it had been too large, the visor too wide, the neck too loose, the weight too heavy. Now, it fit too well. He kept it on for hours, sometimes days, even when no one was around. It became his face, his voice, his silence. They thought he wore it to look dangerous, to seem older, to remind the galaxy who his father was. But that wasn't why. He wore it because it watched. Because behind that dark visor, he could observe everything without being seen. He could study a room, read a face, prepare a shot. And no one could read him in return. Not Bosk, not Aura, not the bounty pucks blinking red with assignments no one wanted. The helmet saw everything, but revealed nothing. At night, when the others drank or cleaned their gear or played Sarlacc with stolen credits, Boba sat in silence, sometimes in the corner, sometimes on the ship, sometimes alone in the dark, watching. They joked about it once, called him the Quiet Mandalorian, said he was trying too hard to act like Jango. He didn't respond, because it wasn't an act, it was survival. He didn't want them to see what was underneath. Not the face, not the memories, not the fear. Because the truth was, under the helmet, he was still the boy who had watched his father die. Still the boy who didn't scream, didn't run. Just stood there, holding a headless mask in the middle of a war, and no one ever came for him. So now, no one would ever see him again. The others started treating him differently. Not with respect, with caution. He wasn't loud, wasn't reckless, wasn't cruel. He was quiet and exact, and that made them uncomfortable. Because the galaxy didn't fear chaos. It feared control. And Boba Fett was learning how to control everything. His voice, his hands, his choices, even his thoughts. Sometimes, too much. He would find himself staring into the black visor's reflection for minutes at a time, trying to remember what his face used to look like, trying to remember if he even still looked like Jango at all. He couldn't tell anymore. The face he was born with was now the face of every soldier in the Republic, every clone on every battlefield, every casualty in every war. He wasn't unique, wasn't rare, wasn't even remembered. But behind the helmet, he was invisible. And invisibility was a weapon. He used it well, slipped through security grids, infiltrated strongholds, spoke in modified tones that didn't sound like his own. Each job further from who he used to be, each target less personal, each kill more silent. He didn't question it, didn't justify it. He just kept moving. Because movement was easier than memory. Still, there were moments, late, quiet, brief, when the others had fallen asleep, when the ship was silent, when the stars outside looked just a little too much like Camino's ocean, black, endless, cold. In those moments, he would lift the helmet off, not for long, just a breath. And in that breath, he would remember the weight of his father's voice, the warmth of his shadow on the landing platform, the way he used to say Boba's name like it meant something more than DNA. But the breath never lasted. Because memory was not protection, so he put the helmet back on, tighter than before, and stayed silent, because behind the mask, he was safe. And the galaxy could only hurt what it could still see. He stopped being a student, stopped being a child, and started becoming a name. Not in the way others did through fame or titles or fire. He became known through silence. They never saw his face. They only saw what followed him. A job finished, a bounty collected, a target that vanished. No mistakes, no questions, no second chances. Boba Fett wasn't the most feared man in the Outer Rim. Not yet, but he was already the one no one wanted to cross. It started with small contracts, leftover work, dead-end targets, missing smugglers, debt dodgers, runaways, the kind of names no one paid attention to. But he finished them all, faster than expected, cleaner than required, without the need for backup. He didn't send messages, didn't demand reputation. He just returned what was asked for, or what remained of it. In a galaxy where bounty hunters were loud, cruel, and theatrical, Boba Fett became something different. Predictable, precise, unseen. Syndicates took notice. Black Sunday Zan Consortium. The Hutt Cartel. Whispers started to form. There's a kid who doesn't miss. No crew, no chatter, just results. Looks like Jango. Works like a droid. At first, they were cautious. Sent feelers, tested him with difficult runs, encrypted exchanges, remote deliveries, no real names. Boba didn't care. He didn't need their trust. He just needed their targets. Because with every finished contract, something was building. Not a fortune, not a legacy, a rhythm, one job after another. No breaks, no reflection. He lived in armor, ate alone, slept near his ship, spoke only when the payment glitched. His voice had changed, deeper now, calmer. But the weight behind it stayed the same. People tried to guess who he really was. Some said he was Jango Fett resurrected. Others believed he was a prototype clone who escaped Kamino. A few swore they'd seen him kill a Jedi. None of it mattered to Boba, because the truth didn't matter in the underworld, only results. He moved through spaceports like vapor. No one stopped him, no one delayed him. His armor carried weight before he spoke, and once he did, no one spoke over him again. There were other hunters, older, louder, bloodier, but none moved like he did. None killed with such clean indifference, because Boba Fett wasn't chasing the kill. He wasn't chasing fear, he was chasing silence. And killing was the only place the galaxy finally went quiet. Some clients tried to get close, offer him bigger shares, hint at partnerships. He refused all of it, not with arrogance, not with insults, just quiet rejection, and a glance from behind the visor that ended the conversation. He began taking jobs others refused, dangerous retrievals, unreachable systems, high-risk, high-failure hunts. He completed them all. One syndicate sent him to Nahaska, a fortress world where 10 hunters had already died trying to extract a rogue slicer. Boba didn't go in guns blazing, didn't issue threats, didn't burn the building. He waited, tracked, learned the slicer's escape route, cut him off 2 days later on an off-world docking pad. No blaster fire, no witnesses. He delivered the body wrapped in its own encrypted data foil. The client said nothing, just wired the credits, and didn't ask for a name again. This became the pattern. He didn't just finish jobs. He finished them without echoes, No survivors, no signatures, no mess. And slowly, the names started to return. Not whispered this time, not doubted. Boba Fett. Not the boy, not Fett's clone, not the one who looks like him, just the name. Carved into bounty boards, etched into underworld whispers, recorded in the minds of those smart enough not to look him in the eye. And through it all he said nothing. Because words didn't matter. Not here, not anymore. Only results, only precision. And the fact that no one, not even his targets, ever saw his face again. He didn't need to speak, because by now, the name spoke for itself. The syndicates didn't fear him because of what he said. They feared him because of what he didn't say. He didn't bargain, didn't threaten, didn't bluff. He just stared and waited. And in that silence, people remembered what happened the last time someone tested him. Boba Fett was never the strongest hunter, never the most brutal, but he was the one who always finished the job. And the galaxy respected finishers. He began working directly with mid-level operatives inside the Black Sun and Hutt space. Not with loyalty, with consistency. They learned quickly. Give him a name. Give him a time. Give him space. And don't ask questions. He wasn't like the others. Didn't drink. Didn't join in celebrations after a successful run. Didn't even look at the spoils. He took his payment, logged the contract, and left. By the time his employers celebrated, he was already light years away. It wasn't just the speed, it was the precision. They once sent him to track a Rodian smuggler who had vanished between Hutt systems shielded by local militia and 2 decoy transports. Most hunters would have tried to intercept both, create chaos, force movement. Boba didn't. He intercepted a transmission no one else noticed, a refueling request disguised in an old mercenary code. He traced the energy signature, located the real transport, boarded it without tripping the sensors. The Rodian never made it past the cockpit. The others didn't believe it until Boba tossed the body bag at the client's feet. No burns, no wreckage, no alarms. Just results. After that, his name moved up. Higher tier contracts, heavier credits, less oversight. He was trusted not because they liked him, but because no one wanted to be the one who slowed him down. Rumors started to spread that he had no home, that he never removed his armor, that he'd already killed 2 Imperial officers for delaying a bounty handoff. They weren't all true, but they didn't have to be. Because mystery was a better weapon than fear. And Boba Fett knew how to be both. He began refusing contracts on principle. He wouldn't take political jobs, wouldn't assassinate children, wouldn't sabotage Republic supply lines unless the price was beyond reason. He wasn't noble, just selective, because not every job was worth the attention, and not every bounty should be collected. He once rejected a Hutt's offer triple pay for eliminating a spice rival. The Hutt threatened him, promised he'd blacklist Boba across his whole network. Boba didn't respond, didn't argue. He just accepted a different job for a competitor. A week later, that Hutt's private cruiser vanished over Bothawi space. No witnesses, no survivors, no record. After that, even Hutt started calling him Fett with a pause. Not like a name, like a warning. Other hunters noticed too. Some tried to copy him, dressing like him, speaking like him, moving alone. They didn't last, because wearing the armor wasn't enough. You had to live in it, and Boba Fett did. He didn't sleep well, didn't dream, didn't linger. He moved from system to system, job to job, always arriving just late enough to avoid the war, and just early enough to see what it left behind. The Clone Wars raged on, and while armies burned planets, he cleaned up what remained in the shadows. Separatist defectors, Republic spies, bounty contracts that governments denied ever existed. He was paid by both sides, used by all, trusted by none. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because in a galaxy screaming with war, Boba Fett had become something rare, predictable, efficient, untouchable. He wasn't feared like a monster, wasn't hated like a traitor. He was avoided, not because of what he might do, but because of what he never failed to do. And because in the end, no one ever saw him coming. Jabba's palace wasn't built for men like him. It was loud, hot, dripping with greed. A shrine to gluttony, where deals were carved in flesh and laughter smelled like rot. Gamorrean guards snorted through tusks. Dancers twirled beneath firelight. Mercenaries leaned on cracked stone with blood still drying on their boots. Everyone was watching someone. Everyone was waiting for betrayal. But Boba Fett said nothing. He walked through the main hall like he belonged there. Helmet on, weapons visible, posture still, and no one stopped him. Not because they respected him, not yet, but because Jabba allowed it. He had summoned Fett personally. No intermediaries, no envoys, just a direct offer and a warning. The palace already had muscle, already had killers. But Jabba didn't want another soldier. He wanted silence, someone who could end things without starting a war. Someone who didn't talk too much, didn't party, didn't ask for introductions. Someone who worked like a shadow, but could stand in the room like a monument. So Boba took the job, not out of loyalty, not for power, but because the pay was clean. And because Jabba, for all his excess, never asked questions twice. The first time Boba stepped onto the dais, the court grew still. He didn't bow, didn't posture. He just stood, waiting. Jabba laughed. Not out of joy but approval. Because in a palace full of desperate men, one had entered who didn't need to beg. Boba was given a corner of the hall, a cold stone seat near the stairs. Not a throne, not a place of honor, but a place where he could see everything. He watched how the guards shifted when threats entered, watched which servants moved too quickly, which ones too slowly, watched how Bib Fortuna's smile never reached his eyes. He learned the rhythm of the palace without speaking, and because he didn't speak, they started to talk around him. He heard everything, what deals were being made, what betrayals were being planned, who was loyal, who was dying too slowly to notice. He never repeated any of it, never used what he heard, but he remembered, because one day, remembering would be more useful than violence. He took missions when they came, Tatooine smugglers, swoop gangs in the Dune Sea, spice runners trying to skim off shipments. He handled them quickly, no mess, no spectacle. Sometimes, the targets never knew they'd been hunted. One was found dead in his sleep, a single blaster shot through the wall of his tent. Another was returned alive, tied with the very chains he'd used to capture others. Jabba liked results. Fett delivered them, but the court didn't trust him. They watched how he sat alone, how he never took off his helmet, how his eyes hidden behind black glass seemed to see more than they should. Some mocked him, quietly, behind his back. Others tried to test him. One Twi'lek mercenary bumped into him during a feast, spilled a drink, made a joke. Boba didn't move. He just tilted his helmet and said one word, "Don't." The next morning, the Twi'lek was gone. No body, no rumors, just gone. No one tested him again. He stayed longer than he planned, not because he enjoyed it, but because the palace gave him something the rest of the galaxy didn't. Stability, a place to think, to rebuild, to observe. He didn't speak to the dancers, didn't join the hunts, didn't laugh with the others when someone begged for mercy. He simply sat and waited. Because Boba Fett was no one's servant. Not Jabba's, not the court's, not the galaxy's. And every day he sat there in armor that never came off. The court began to understand something they couldn't say aloud. He wasn't one of them. He was something else. A reminder, a presence, a shape the light couldn't touch. And even among monsters, he was the one they didn't dare turn their back on. Power didn't change him. It only made the silence heavier. Every hunter eventually learns that fear has a sound. For some, it's blaster fire. For others, it's breathing inside a helmet that no longer feels like armor. For Boba Fett, it was quiet. Jabba's palace gave him everything he was supposed to want: respect, credits, control. He had authority. He had freedom. He had purpose. But none of it mattered, because the one thing he wanted, the galaxy couldn't give. Peace. Not victory. Not vengeance. Just silence that didn't hurt. He tried to find it in routine, polishing the armor until the scratches disappeared, rechecking the same weapons he never used twice, sitting in the same chair night after night, staring at the sandstorms beyond the gates. But even in stillness, there were ghosts. He heard Jango's voice in the hum of slave-first engines. He saw Kamino's endless rain in the oil dripping from the rafters. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw the purple flash that ended everything. He didn't speak of it, didn't let the memories slow his hand. But they lived in the armor with him, in the joints, in the cracks, in the smell of the leather that hadn't been replaced since Geonosis. Sometimes he wondered if that was why he never took it off. Because the armor remembered, and as long as it did, he didn't have to. The court saw the myth, the bounty hunter who never missed, the man who stood beside Jabba and never flinched, the shadow who ended wars in a single shot. But beneath it, he was fading, not broken, just empty. He had become the thing others feared most, someone who couldn't be reached. Someone whose silence wasn't coldness, but distance. He had cut away too much. Every time someone spoke his name, he felt less like a person, more like a weapon someone else had loaded. Jabba saw it too, and liked it, because a weapon that didn't question never misfires. But even weapons rust. There were nights when he sat alone in the hangar, the mask still on, staring at his reflection in the ship's hull. The faint curve of a face beneath metal, the outline of what used to be human. He wondered if the galaxy remembered Jango, if anyone still spoke the name Fett with respect, or if they only saw another hired gun in Mandalorian armor. Maybe that's all he had ever been. Maybe legacy was just another bounty one you could never collect. He started to notice the patterns. The endless cycle of credits and corpses. The way every syndicate eventually turned on itself. The way every empire collapsed under the weight of its own greed. The galaxy didn't change, only the faces did. And all of them looked like his. One night, Jabba asked him to stay after the others had gone. The hall was quiet. The torches burned low. The Hutt's voice was softer than usual. "You've done well, Fett, you always do. Tell me what drives you." Boba didn't answer, because he didn't know. Jabba laughed slow, deep, knowing. "Silence," he said. "That's what makes you dangerous. The loud ones die first." Fett said nothing, but inside, something moved. A small, tired ache that words couldn't reach, because he knew the truth. Silence doesn't protect, it corrodes. And every day he wore the armor, something inside him rusted a little more. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had seen too much to fear that. He was afraid of vanishing not into legend, but into nothing. Into the myth he had created. He had become what the galaxy paid for. A symbol, a shadow. A perfect imitation of the man he once called father. But the helmet couldn't hold the things that made Jango real: the warmth, the humanity, the voice that once said his name like it mattered. Those things were gone now, replaced by echoes, and by the galaxy's belief that Boba Fett was unbreakable. He let them believe it, because it was easier than admitting the truth. He wasn't unbreakable. He was already broken. He just hadn't stopped moving yet. And as the suns of Tatooine burned through the desert sky, the bounty hunter sat beneath the weight of his armor, motionless, wordless, and waiting for the day when even silence would finally let him rest. The war ended, but the killing didn't. The banners changed, the Jedi vanished, and the Republic became the Empire in a single breath. But in the shadows, nothing changed. Contracts still flowed, credits still bought silence, and Boba Fett still moved from system to system like a storm without wind. But now, there were new clients, new targets, and a new kind of danger. The Empire didn't operate like the syndicates. It didn't negotiate. It didn't flatter. It gave coordinates and demanded results. They didn't care who he was. Didn't care that he had worn Jango's armor since before the Clone Wars ended. Didn't ask what his name meant. They only saw a tool, a weapon they could point, and for a while, Boba let them. He hunted separatist holdouts, former commanders who had outlived their usefulness, politicians who knew too much. He didn't ask questions, didn't attend briefings, didn't salute. He took the job, collected the credits, and disappeared before they could ask for more. But the Empire didn't forget. They watched him, because even beneath the armor, they recognized the face. It was the face of 1,000,000 soldiers. The same eyes that had fought on Kamino, that had marched through the Outer Rim, that had turned on the Jedi when Order 66 came. His face was not a secret. It was a reminder, and some didn't like being reminded. A few tried to probe him. Officers who asked where he was trained. Stormtroopers who joked about clone defects. Commanders who stared too long. He ignored them, but he didn't forget, because deep down, he knew what they saw. They didn't see Boba Fett. They saw a relic, a mistake, a face the Empire had tried to bury. The clone army had been replaced, phased out, quietly, efficiently. Stormtroopers now wore masks. Recruits from every corner of the galaxy. No longer brothers, just bodies. But Boba's face hadn't changed, and that made him dangerous. Because he was a living reminder of what the Empire used to be, and what it chose to erase. He didn't care about their politics, didn't care about the new ranks or regulations. But he knew how the Empire operated. It didn't tolerate loose ends. And Boba Fett had never followed their rules. He still flew Slave Eye, still chose his own contracts, still spoke only when it mattered. He never wore their symbols, never answered their questions, never showed them his eyes. But he kept getting jobs, because his results spoke louder than their orders. One day, they sent him to clean up a failed intelligence breach, a slicer cell on Coruscant's lower levels that had stolen data on the clone decommissioning files. He didn't care what the files contained, didn't ask who had leaked them. He only cared about the target. But when he arrived, something changed. The leader of the cell wasn't some off-world rebel. He was a former clone commander. CT-1475, retired, erased, but not silent. He hadn't run from the Empire. He had been cast aside, no pension, no rank, no legacy, just a number stripped from history. And when Boba cornered him, the clone didn't fight. He just looked at him, long, hard. "You're one of us," he said. "No," Boba answered. "I'm what they wanted to forget." He fired one shot. No witnesses, no questions. The report was filed, the payment wired. But something followed him back to the ship that day. A feeling he couldn't shake. Because for the first time, his helmet hadn't hidden him. It had exposed him. He started seeing them everywhere. Not in armor, not on duty, but in alleys, in rusted scrapyards, in the corners of spaceports where no one looked twice. They were clones, older now, tired, fading, their armor gone, their ranks forgotten. Most of them didn't even wear weapons anymore. Some carried tools, others limped from old injuries. All of them walked with the quiet weight of being erased. They didn't salute, didn't stand straight. They just existed, and Boba watched them. From a distance, through the visor, like staring into a past that never belonged to him, and yet somehow always had. He never approached, never spoke. But once, one of them spoke to him. A blind clone on Corellia, standing near a freight lift, scratching symbols into the wall with a dull knife. CT-6116, he whispered, as if trying to remember his own name. Then he turned toward Boba, as if he could see through the visor. "You're different," he said. "You stayed sharp." Boba didn't answer, didn't nod, just kept walking. Because he didn't know how to answer someone who wore his face, but not his purpose. The Empire had discarded them, quietly, systematically. They were too independent, too familiar, too human. Stormtroopers didn't question orders, didn't remember names, didn't look in the mirror and see the face of someone who used to matter. But clones did. And now, they were everywhere, scattered, alone. A million reminders of a war the galaxy didn't want to remember. Boba didn't pity them, but he couldn't ignore them. Because every time he saw one, he saw what he could have been. If he had stayed, if he had followed orders, if he had aged like they did. Sometimes he'd catch his own reflection in a visor, in a docking window, in the face of a man he didn't recognize until it was too late. They were all him, but none of them were him, because he had never been one of them. Not really. He was born the same way, built from the same template, grown in the same storm. But he wasn't trained to follow, wasn't programmed to obey, wasn't told what to believe. He had a father, they had protocols, and now they had nothing. One mission took him to a decommissioning station above the planet Vasilika, a cold orbital facility where aging clones were processed out of service. He wasn't there for them. His contract was a rogue intelligence officer. But when he walked the halls, the clones turned to look, not out of fear, not out of duty, but because they saw something impossible. A face they hadn't seen in years, untouched, unaged, still wearing the armor. Some looked away, some nodded once. One of them just stood and saluted, his hand trembling from old wounds. Boba didn't stop, because there was nothing he could say. They were ghosts, and he wasn't here to bring them peace. He was here to do what he always did. End the job, leave before it got personal. But that time, it already was. Because every footstep echoed with a question. Was this what Jango wanted? 1,000 copies of himself scattered, forgotten, slowly dying beneath a flag that never remembered their names. Or had it always been inevitable? The war, the silence, the disposal. He didn't know. He only knew that he couldn't stop seeing them. Not when he slept, not when he fought, not even when he looked in the mirror. Because now, his reflection stared back with more than just his eyes. It stared with theirs. Working for the Empire was simple, until it wasn't. At first, the contracts came like clockwork. Intercepted transmissions, rebel spies, defectors who knew too much. Every job clean, every payment immediate, every mission sealed with the same code, classified. He didn't care who gave the orders, didn't care who he killed. The Empire was efficient, and efficiency was something he understood. But then came the jobs that felt different, the ones that smelled wrong, the ones where the target didn't run. They started sending him after clones, quietly, without saying why. Retired officers, old commandos, men who had done their part and now carried secrets the Empire didn't want spoken aloud. At first, he ignored the pattern, told himself it was coincidence, that they were just contracts like any other, but the numbers didn't lie. CT-8821 on Cato Nemoidia, CC-1993 near Ryloth. A pair of ARC troopers hiding on Naboo. Different names, different systems, same orders, all erased. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. He already knew what the Empire was doing, cleaning its history, erasing the faces that built its foundation, replacing soldiers with recruits who would never remember how it all began. It wasn't personal, it was protocol, but that didn't make it easier, because every time he looked through his scope, every time a clone's helmet cracked open under his fire, he saw the same face staring back at him. His own. He told himself it didn't matter, that this was survival, that the galaxy didn't reward hesitation. But something inside him had started to slow. The Empire noticed. They never accused him, never warned him. They just adjusted his assignments. Fewer credits, harder kills, more surveillance. He knew what it meant. He was being tested. To them, he wasn't a hunter. He was an experiment that hadn't failed yet. And if he ever did, they'd erase him too. He kept working, because stopping meant being noticed, and being noticed by the Empire was death. He delivered results, did the jobs no one else would take, kept his distance from the officers who whispered too much. But even silence has consequences. One day, a job came across his feed encrypted, flagged red. The target, Imperial scientist, codename Vaughn, former Kaminoan liaison. The mission was familiar. Retrieve the data. No witnesses. But something in the brief caught his eye. The scientist's last known location, Tipoca City, Kamino, the storm world where it all began. He hadn't been back since Jango's death. Had sworn never to return. But the job was too specific to ignore, too close to who he was to dismiss. He took it. When Slave Eye entered Kamino's orbit, the clouds still rolled the same way, endless, white, unbroken. The city lights shimmered beneath the waves like a memory refusing to die. He landed silently, walking the same metal corridors he once called home. They were empty now, abandoned. Only the sound of rain and echoing alarms remained. He found the lab, the data, and the scientist already dying from blaster fire. She looked up when she saw him. "You're him," she said. "The original, the unaltered one." He didn't answer, just took the drive and turned to leave. But she grabbed his arm, her hand shaking. "They wanted to destroy it," she whispered. "The template, your father's DNA, the last strand. They said, no more Fett." Her voice faded, her grip loosened. He stood there for a long time, listening to the rain, to the ghosts moving in the hallways, to the silence of a legacy being erased one drop at a time. Then he left, without a word, without a look back. He didn't deliver the data, didn't finish the job, because for the first time, he wasn't sure who the real target was. He didn't return to the Empire, didn't send the report, didn't answer their transmissions. For weeks, the message light on his console blinked red. He let it, until even the Empire learned what others already knew, that chasing Boba Fett was never worth the price. He moved through the outer rim like a shadow cutting through fog, world to world, job to job, never long enough to leave footprints. But the silence followed him. Every reflection, every face beneath a trooper's visor, every voice filtered through a stormtrooper's comm, they all sounded the same. His own voice, Jango's echo, the galaxy's cruel reminder that identity was just another weapon to be used and discarded. He told himself it didn't matter, that he was free, that he had built something the clones never could, a life without command, without numbers, without belonging. But freedom and loneliness sound the same when you're the only one who hears them. He began to dream again. Of Kamino's reign, of a boy pressing his hand against cold glass, watching soldiers march in perfect formation. Of a father's promise whispered above the hum of engines, "Don't trust anyone, not even me." The words stayed with him longer than the dream, because now, years later, they made sense. Jango hadn't been warning him about betrayal. He'd been warning him about himself. The boy who once wanted to avenge his father was gone. What remained was something colder, a man hunting pieces of his own reflection across the galaxy. The Empire labeled him unreliable, blacklisted his transponder, filed him under observation. But they still hired him, because in the end, they always needed him. And he always delivered. Until one night, on a forgotten moon near the Hydian Way, he found something he didn't expect. An old clone outpost collapsed, half buried under dust. No signals, no life. He entered anyway. Inside, the air smelled of rust and memory. The walls still carried fading paint unit symbols, tally marks, a child's drawing of Kamino scratched into the steel. And in the center of the room sat a single helmet, white, cracked, empty. He picked it up, held it the way he once held Jango's. Same weight, same silence. But this time, there was no grief, only understanding. This was what the clones became when the galaxy stopped needing them. Artifacts, forgotten, unlabeled. He set the helmet down gently, not out of pity, out of respect, because for the first time, he realized he wasn't running from them. He was running toward them, toward the thing they all shared. An ending that no one would witness. Outside, the wind tore across the dunes. He watched the horizon until the stars began to fade, then spoke softly, not to the dead, not to his father, but to himself. "They built an army to fight their wars," he said. "But they built me to survive them." The words felt strange leaving his mouth, like something Jango might have said, like something he was never meant to believe. He left the base before sunrise, didn't take the helmet, didn't look back. Because looking back was a luxury for people who still believed in pasts. He had none left, only what he could have been, only what he still was. The galaxy called him a legend, a bounty hunter without mercy, a man who could kill anyone, anywhere, for the right price. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either, because legends don't bleed. And Boba Fett did every time he saw a clone's face, every time he heard a voice that sounded like his own, every time the helmet grew heavier for reasons he couldn't explain. He didn't seek redemption, didn't crave forgiveness. He just wanted the noise to stop. And maybe, somewhere deep in the armor's echo, a piece of the boy from Kamino still waited not for peace, but for understanding. Because being hunted isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about memory. Sometimes it's about the faces that never stop following you, even when they're gone. As Slave Eye rose into the black, his reflection flickered across the cockpit glass, a man with no face, no home, no rest. The hunter, and the hunted. And for the first time, he stopped trying to tell the difference. It started with a name, Han Solo. Not the first time Boba Fett heard it, and not the first time someone wanted him dead. But this time, the price was different. Because it wasn't just personal, it was political. The bounty came from Jabba, not an order, a demand. Solo had crossed him too many times, too many shipments dumped, too many debts left unpaid. And Jabba didn't forget, especially not when his name was mocked in cantinas across 5 systems. Boba didn't ask for context. He didn't care why Solo ran. He only cared that he ran loud. Smugglers had egos. They left trails, and Solo left more than most. Every system had someone who had seen the Millennium Falcon. Every outpost had a technician who remembered its sensor profile. Every bounty hunter wanted to catch him. But Boba didn't want the chase. He wanted the result. He traced Solo through hyperspace anomalies, watched fuel patterns, interpreted encrypted pings buried in cargo routes. While others chased shadows, Fett read the math, and it brought him closer. He almost caught Solo near Gaul, but something shifted. Rebel movements, Imperial activity. Then came word through quiet Imperials with too much to drink and not enough discipline. Solo had fallen into something bigger. Bigger than smuggling. Bigger than Jabba. The rebels had made him a hero. And heroes attracted enemies. Fett listened, watched, and waited. Then it came. A transmission buried deep in an encrypted relay. Solo had been spotted on Hoth. Fett moved before the data was verified, because instincts didn't wait for confirmation. He arrived just before the fleet, before the snow turned to ash, before the base melted under the fury of 1,000 boots. He didn't fire, didn't expose himself. He just watched the chaos unfold, and locked onto the Falcon. He followed it from a distance, too close to be lost, too far to be seen. Every jump, every signal. He traced it like breath fogging a mirror. And then, it disappeared. No signal, no engine trail, no power signature. Gone. Fett didn't panic. He calculated, analyzed where they might go. Where Solo would feel safe. Cloud City. Bespin. It wasn't obvious to most. But Fett wasn't most. Bespin had no ground defenses, no strong Imperial presence, a quiet place to hide and repair. A place where a smuggler still had friends. Fett didn't land. Not at first. He contacted someone else. Someone who had already been watching. Darth Vader. The Empire didn't broadcast its bounties. It erased problems. But Vader had his own reasons. Reasons that went beyond Jabba, beyond the price on Solo's head. And Fett was smart enough to recognize when someone else's obsession could clear his path. So he made a deal. Vader would use Solo as bait. Fett would get his prize frozen, contained, and delivered. It was unusual, but it was efficient. The Falcon arrived. The trap was set. And Fett didn't need to lift a finger. He watched from the shadows of Cloud City's walkways, watched Imperial troops lead Solo away, watched Leia shout through the hallway, watched Chewbacca break against his bonds. He said nothing, did nothing, because the hunt was already over. But something in him shifted when he saw Solo walk past. This wasn't just another bounty, not a pirate, not a deserter. Solo walked like a man who knew he was already lost, but kept walking anyway. Fett didn't respect many, but in that moment he understood Solo. They were both men chased by systems bigger than them, one by debt, the other by legacy, and both about to be frozen in place. He knew it was a mistake, but he made it anyway. Because in the underworld, power comes in 2 forms, the kind you fight for, and the kind you accept in silence. And Darth Vader didn't give options. He gave silence. When Fett arrived at Cloud City, Vader was already there. So were his stormtroopers. The corridors were filled with tension. No blasters, no alarms, just quiet control. Lando Calrissian, the Baron Administrator of the city, didn't even look Boba in the eye. He was already defeated, held in place by leverage he could never outrun. Fett stood beside the Empire's executioner, but he wasn't a partner. He was a tool, and he knew it. The deal was simple. Solo would be captured, frozen, handed over to Fett as payment for cooperation. It sounded clean, too clean, because Fett had dealt with powerful men before, and he'd learned something no bounty hunter ever forgets. When someone doesn't blink, they're not negotiating. Vader wanted Solo for something else. He never said why. But the way he looked at the smuggler, it wasn't about money. It was about control. And Boba recognized that stare. He'd seen it before in the eyes of slavers, syndicate leaders, officers who thought fear replaced loyalty. He didn't like it, but he needed the payout, and he needed to leave with his prize intact. So he stood silently as the trap closed. Leia captured, Chewbacca bound. Solo shoved forward in cuffs, jaw clenched but eyes steady. Boba said nothing, but inside, he was watching the cracks form. Lando protested the terms. He reminded Vader of the deal, tried to keep his people safe. But Vader rewrote the deal with each breath. Now Leia would remain. Now Chewbacca wouldn't leave. Now the Empire would stay longer. Fett didn't care about Lando, didn't care about Cloud City, but he cared about Solo. Because Vader wasn't freezing him to help the bounty. He was testing a method, carbonite containment. It had never been used on a living person. The process was dangerous, potentially lethal, and Fett didn't want to return to Jabba with a corpse. So he spoke. Just once. What if he dies? Vader turned. Not in anger, but in calculation. He's no good to me dead. A pause. The faintest flicker of mutual understanding. Vader gave the order to calibrate the chamber. Safe parameters. At least, safe enough. It was a rare thing, a Sith Lord adjusting his methods for a bounty hunter. But it wasn't respect, it was necessity. Because Vader needed Solo, and Boba needed him alive. The room was cold, not from temperature but from what was about to happen. Solo was lowered into the chamber. Chewbacca roared. Leia screamed his name. And Boba watched. He didn't look away when the gas flooded. Didn't flinch when the hiss became a scream. Didn't blink when the platform rose again, carrying a block of metal where a man used to be. Han Solo, frozen in carbonite, mouth open mid-breath, eyes wide, locked in defiance that would never fade. It was the cleanest trap Fett had ever seen, but it didn't feel like a win. The others stared in silence. Even Vader paused, because the smuggler hadn't begged, hadn't broken. He had simply accepted. That was what Fett couldn't forget. Not the freeze, not the weight of the block, but the look before it sealed. The look of a man who knew he wouldn't be saved, and didn't need to be. Fett checked the vitals, confirmed Solo was alive. Barely. He said nothing more, because the deal was done, and the betrayal had already begun. Not from him, not from Solo, from the ones who made the deals, and kept changing the terms. The chamber hissed, metal groaned, and the air turned colder than space. Boba Fett stood still. Every instinct told him to step back, to turn away from what was happening. But he didn't move, because this was his prize, and his curse. The sound of the freezing process was not mechanical, it was alive. A scream smothered by gas. A heartbeat slowed by science. A man being reduced to silence in real time. Fett had seen death in every form, burned, crushed, vaporized. But this was different. This wasn't death. It was suspension. The difference was worse. He could see Solo's breath crystallize in the air before vanishing. See his hands clench one last time before locking in place. See his eyes remain open, staring into something only he could see. When the steam cleared, there was no sound. just the echo of machinery settling into stillness. The carbonite slab rose from the pit, a statue, a coffin, a victory. Vader inspected it first. "Perfect," he said, as if perfection was something measurable. Fett didn't answer. He was watching the face. The frozen fear mixed with defiance. The image that would outlast them both. It wasn't respect he felt. And it wasn't pride. It was recognition. Because for the first time in years, Boba Fett saw himself, not as the hunter, not as the legend whispered through cantinas, but as the thing he had become, trapped inside armor that had turned into its own cage. Solo's face was a mirror, frozen in the same quiet acceptance Fett carried every day. Neither of them chose their fate. Both had been shaped by others. Both had been used by systems they could never control. Fett felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not sorrow, not guilt, just weight. The weight of knowing that this wasn't just carbonite. It was proof that a man could be preserved without ever being remembered. Vader turned toward him. "The bounty is yours," he said. The voice was calm, commanding, empty. Fett nodded, but the words didn't sound like victory, because he knew what came next. The Empire would claim the credit. The story would spread through its propaganda machines. The capture would be rewritten into something cleaner, something more imperial. And in the end, no one would remember who actually pulled the trigger, or who carried the weight. It didn't matter. Fett never worked for glory. But something about this job felt hollow. He helped move the slab. Its weight surprised him. Carbonite wasn't just metal, it was time solidified. It fought gravity in a way that made even his armor feel heavier. Every step echoed. Every movement sounded final. Leia screamed after them. Chewbacca roared, fighting through troopers who didn't understand what loss truly meant. Fett didn't turn, didn't look back. He kept walking, because that was what bounty hunters did. They moved forward while everyone else fell apart. But as the lift doors closed, the reflection of the slab caught his visor. For a moment, he saw both faces together, Solo's and his own. One frozen by carbonite, the other by choice. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. On the flight deck, technicians sealed the slab inside the cargo hold of Slave I. They congratulated him, offered to transmit reports to Imperial Command. Fett dismissed them with a glance. He didn't want records. He didn't want witnesses. He just wanted distance. As the ship lifted from Cloud City, the sky outside burned orange against the gas clouds. A beautiful sunset for a world built on betrayal. He sat in the cockpit, helmet still on, watching the readouts. Solo's vitals steady, heart slowed to near silence. Alive, trapped, preserved. A perfect job. So why did it feel like loss? The hum of the engines filled the cabin. Boba adjusted the controls, but his hands felt heavier than the metal around him. He told himself it was fatigue. He told himself it was nothing. But deep down, he knew. He hadn't just frozen Han Solo. He had frozen the last piece of himself that could still feel. And the galaxy would remember the image a man turned to metal, and another man already halfway there. The flight from Bespin was quiet. Too quiet. Slave I drifted through hyperspace, engines humming like a heartbeat trapped in metal. Behind him, sealed in carbonite, Han Solo slept in perfect stillness. Boba Fett didn't sleep. He never did. Not well. He sat in the pilot's chair, helmet off for once. Eyes fixed on the stars that never stopped moving. Light bending. Space folding. Time repeating itself again and again. As if the galaxy couldn't decide when to stop. He checked the vitals. Stable. Alive. No decay in the containment seals. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. He'd done everything right. Tracked the mark. Negotiated with the Empire. survived Vader's deal. And yet, all he felt was the cold. It clung to him like frost, seeping through armor joints, biting beneath the skin. The kind of cold that didn't come from space but from knowing the job was finished, and nothing waited on the other side. He looked at the slab again, at the faint outline of Solo's face beneath the frozen gray. The smuggler's last expression wasn't fear, it was disbelief, as if he still couldn't accept that his story could end so quietly. Fett understood that look. He'd seen it in mirrors. He'd seen it in his father. He'd seen it in every man who thought control meant freedom. He rose from the chair and walked toward the hold. The sound of his boots echoed across the metal floor. The slab loomed tall against the dim lights. Smooth, cold, unforgiving. He placed a hand on it. The surface was colder than the void. No pulse, no movement, just stillness. Some hunters talked to their kills, bragged, mocked. Fett said nothing, because he knew how easy it was to end up on the wrong side of that silence. He thought about Vader, about the way the Sith had used him, promised cooperation, then rewritten the deal. The Empire never paid in full, not in credits, not in respect, not in truth. He wondered how many others had made the same mistake. How many bounty hunters had stood beside the Empire, thinking they were partners, not pawns. He'd tell himself it didn't matter, that a hunter works alone, that credits are all that last. But as slave I cut through hyperspace. Even that lie felt smaller than before. When Tatooine came into view, the sensors flickered red against the dust storms. The planet looked like it was bleeding sunlight, dry, endless, lifeless. Perfect for men like Jabba, perfect for endings. The hangar guards met him at the gates of the palace. They didn't ask what was inside the cargo bay. Everyone already knew. Word had spread across the rim faster than any transmission could travel. Han Solo, captured, alive, delivered by Fett. The crowd parted when he entered. Jabba's laugh filled the hall, deep, booming, gluttonous. Fett, my boy, you've done it. He didn't respond. He never did. Two droids lifted the slab upright. The crowd gasped. Jabba applauded. The room smelled like victory and rot. To them, this was triumph. To Fett, it was delivery. He watched as the Hutt examined his prize, tracing his slimy hand over the frozen smuggler's face. Beautiful, Jabba said. A decoration worthy of my hall. Fett turned away. He didn't stay for the celebration, didn't drink, didn't listen to the laughter echoing through the palace halls. He just walked back to the hangar, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the suns of Tatooine burned across the sand like twin eyes that never blinked. He put his helmet back on. The world dimmed instantly. Safer that way. Inside the ship, everything was quiet again. He sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the reflection on the cockpit glass. The bounty was complete. His reputation was untouchable. His name feared across every system. And still, he felt nothing. Because victory never feels warm. Not when it comes from betrayal. Not when the price of success is silence. He powered the ship down and listened to the cooling metal tick like a slow heartbeat. Somewhere behind him, in Jabba's hall, Han Solo would hang for years, a frozen legend, trapped in a moment that never ended. And Boba Fett would keep moving, job to job, planet to planet, always forward, never free. The hunter had won. But the man inside the armor had been gone a long time. He had been in worse places, worse battles, tighter odds. But not like this, not like the pit. The last thing he remembered was the scream of a jetpack, not his own, but someone else's. A blind man with a metal staff. A stumble, a misfire, and then the air vanished. He didn't fall, he was taken. Dragged downward by sand and gravity. pulled through a maw of teeth older than any city. The Sarlacc didn't bite. It swallowed. The screams of the palace turned to echoes. The light collapsed behind him. And in that moment, Boba Fett, hunter of Jedi, weapon of syndicates, ghost of Kamino, disappeared from the galaxy. They said he died, that he was devoured, erased like a legend burned from a scroll. But the truth was worse. He survived, and survival was not a gift. The inside of the beast was not flesh. It was memory. It was silence. At first, there was pain. Skin boiled from acid. Armor plates hissing under the weight of digestion. His lungs fought for air, then fought for nothing. He tried to activate his gauntlet. Flares failed. The comlink was useless. Even his rangefinder cracked in the fall. He was drowning in heat, his suit sealing to his skin. The Sarlacc didn't kill fast, it held. And then came the sound. Not a roar, not a breath, but something slower. A deep, wet heartbeat pulsing through the walls. A rhythm that didn't belong to the hunter but to the prison that had claimed him. The creature didn't eat like a rancor. It absorbed, layer by layer, bone by bone, and thought by thought. Days passed, or hours, or years. Time didn't work in the dark. He stopped trying to escape, stopped moving, let the heat cocoon him, let the quiet drag him downward. He thought about Kamino, the rain, the sound of waves hitting glass, his father's voice, the scent of oil on armor. He thought about Solo, frozen, weightless, preserved in defiance. He wondered if that was better, to be frozen in time, rather than dissolved by it. Every few moments, if they could be called, that his mind flickered. Hallucinations, or memories. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. He saw Aurra Sing, Bossk, Cad Bane, all staring at him from the edge of the pit. No one helped, no one would, because Fett wasn't meant to be rescued. He was meant to be feared. Feared enough that no one dared look for him. The Sarlacc knew that. Somehow, it knew. And it fed on more than flesh. It fed on silence, on memory, on the ache of legacy forgotten. He whispered things he didn't know he remembered. Clone designations, base protocols, coordinates to a Mandalorian vault he'd never seen. He cried once. Just once. And even that was taken from him. The Sarlacc didn't care who he was. Didn't care about reputation. Didn't care about armor or war. It only knew that something had fallen into it, and it wanted that thing to forget it had ever been alive. His body stopped burning eventually. The acids lost interest. The skin hardened. He was no longer prey. He was becoming something else. Something not dead but not Boba Fett either. He dreamed of fire, of dragging himself out, of burning the monster from the inside. But when he opened his eyes, there was no fire, no light, only the weight of every second pressing down like armor he couldn't remove. He started counting, not numbers, but breaths, every one earned, every one stolen back from the pit. This wasn't a battle. There were no tactics, no allies, just a man inside a monster, and the monster inside the man. He didn't pray, didn't scream, didn't call out for help, because Boba Fett had always known something most people refuse to admit. No one is coming. If you want to live, you fight for every breath, even if no one hears it, even if no one remembers you were there, especially then. So he curled his fingers, flexed the gauntlet, felt the click of a charge ignite beneath his palm. And for the first time since falling, he remembered who he was. He was Boba Fett, and he wasn't done. There was no light, no voice, not even the whisper of movement, only silence. But this was not the kind of silence that calms. It was a silence that scraped against the soul, deep, hungry, endless. Boba Fett had escaped blasters, beasts, and betrayals. But he had never escaped time. Not like this. Inside the Sarlacc, time was not a line. It was a circle, a loop of thoughts, pain, breath, stillness, and then pain again. His mind cracked first, not his armor. The Beskar held. His thoughts didn't. He remembered things he shouldn't. Conversations from years ago. Jango's laugh echoing off Camino walls. Orders shouted across dust-covered battlefields. The weight of clones dying in his place. And then he remembered voices that weren't real. The Sarlacc didn't speak, but somehow it listened, and what it heard, it echoed back in twisted shapes. It would hum with the pitch of dying droids, groan with the breath of fallen Jedi, whisper with the tone of Boba's own voice. Younger, scared, unchanged. He heard Jango telling him to get up, to reload, to aim again. But there was nothing to aim at, only walls of living tissue, and memories too soft to hold. He tried to focus on survival, rationed energy, slowed his pulse, calibrated the microfiltration unit in his helmet so it would recycle every trace of moisture. He waited for systems to fail, but they didn't. His armor was a tomb that wouldn't break. And so, the waiting became worse. Because he wasn't dying, he was decaying inside his mind. He wondered how long the others had lasted, if they screamed, if they fought, if they begged, and if, at some point, they forgot they had names. He promised himself he wouldn't forget. He whispered it into the dark. "My name is Boba Fett." At first, it gave him strength. Then, it became a curse. Because every time he said it, there was less voice behind the name, less meaning, less memory. Who was Boba Fett, if no one was left to remember him? What was a legacy inside a pit that did not speak? He dreamed of light, of twin suns over Tatooine, of cold Camino rain hitting the Durasteel training pads, of open air. But the dreams began to shift. The suns melted into eyes. The rain turned into blood. The air collapsed under its own gravity. It wasn't sleep. It was forgetting. And it came slowly. Each memory dragged under like a starship swallowed by a black hole. One breath at a time. One image. One face. He remembered Bosk, and then forgot what his voice sounded like. He remembered Jabba, then couldn't recall if he'd seen him with both eyes open. He remembered Solo, frozen, silent, and then he wasn't sure if it had even happened. The Sarlacc didn't need to consume flesh. It consumed context, stripped meaning from everything it touched. He tried marking time with scratches, but the walls pulsed. He couldn't tell what was his scratch and what was the creature's breath. He used his wrist-mounted flamethrower once. The fire lasted only a second. It hissed, burned, and vanished. The walls closed in tighter. It wasn't resistance, it was indifference. Fett understood. He had spent years becoming a symbol of fear, of strength, of unbreakable will. But here, none of that mattered. He wasn't feared, he wasn't even noticed, and still he endured. He didn't call for help, didn't scream, didn't curse the stars, because some part of him still remembered what it meant to survive. And in that memory was a shape, not a weapon, not a name, but a decision. He would not die here. He would not let this thing wear his identity like skin. He would not become one more whisper in the pit. He was not meant to be silent. He was meant to be seen. Even if no one ever saw him again. He stopped counting breaths, stopped thinking about time, let go of everything except the part of him that still moved, the part that still fought. Even if the fight was 1 inch at a time, even if the enemy was silence itself, that was enough. Because he had one weapon left. Not fire, Not explosives, not rage, will. And will, he knew, could outlast anything, even a curse buried in the belly of a beast. It began with a voice, not real, not outside him, but louder than anything in the pit. "Why are you still alive?" Boba opened his eyes, but there was no sight, just the burning weight of pressure against his helmet. Still inside the Sarlacc, still breathing, still fading. But the voice did not stop. It came again, this time in Jango's voice. "You failed. You watched me die." He knew it wasn't real. He knew his father's voice, and this wasn't it. But knowing didn't stop the bleeding, didn't stop the crack in his chest that no armor could seal. The walls of the creature pulsed, the heartbeat of something ancient, uncaring, and alive. And within that heartbeat, the voices multiplied. He heard the clones, thousands of them, speaking in unison, not angry, not sad, just disappointed. "You let us die. You let us become shadows." He curled his fists, tried to block them out, tried to remember where they ended and where he began. But the Sarlacc blurred those lines. It pulled from memory and molded illusions, and illusions began to feel like truths. He saw Aurra Singh's silhouette leaning against the edge of the pit, her white skin glowing like a ghost. She didn't offer a hand, she just smiled. Cruel, knowing. "I told you you'd die for nothing." Next came Bossk, not the real one, but a twisted version, towering, mocking. "You think this is honor? You think you're strong? Even the sand forgot you." And then came the ones who didn't speak. Younglings, Jedi, civilians caught in blaster crossfire. Their faces floated past him in the dark, not in anger, not in revenge, just watching, as if waiting for him to admit something. The Sarlacc wasn't just digesting his body, it was burning through his past, turning every decision, every kill, every silence into a reflection. And there was no escape from reflection. He saw himself as a child, holding his father's helmet in the arena, standing alone on a battlefield that wasn't his, too young to bury the man he came from, too old to cry. The child looked up at him. "Why did you become this?" The words shattered something inside, because the truth was he didn't know. He hadn't chosen to become a legend. He hadn't planned to be feared. He had followed a trail left by a father who was never finished, a legacy forged in cloning tanks, molded in war, and sharpened by loss. He didn't become ruthless, he became empty. And now, in the belly of a beast that didn't understand death, that emptiness screamed. He thought of Solo, of freezing him, delivering him, watching him become silent. Had that been justice, or vengeance, or just another job? The Sarlacc didn't care, but Boba did. Or maybe he finally had to. The visions changed. He saw Tatooine, saw the pit from the outside, felt the heat of 2 suns on his back. He was standing beside himself, but the version of him standing there wore no armor, no blaster, no voice, just silence, like a statue built from regret. That version turned its head slowly, eyes hollow, expression blank. "You escaped everything, except this." And then came the scream, not from the Sarlacc, not from the visions, from him. It was the first sound he had made in days, or weeks, or centuries. A scream not of fear but defiance, because he saw the trap now. The Sarlacc didn't just kill. It convinced its prey they were already dead, and he refused. He was Boba Fett, son of Jango, the last unmodified clone, the weapon that walked like a man. The scream shattered the illusions. They fell like ash into the void, and for the first time, the dark was quiet, truly quiet. No more ghosts, no more questions, only will. His gauntlet hissed. A low energy pulse arced across his arm. He hadn't used the flamethrower again, but he could feel the charge. One last time. And he knew what he had to do. Because the only way out was through the visions, through the walls, through the silence. He wasn't done yet, he never had been. And in that moment, the Sarlacc finally felt fear. He didn't crawl out of the pit, he burned out of it. The first explosion shook the creature's stomach. Acid hissed, the walls shrieked, and for the first time since falling, the Sarlacc screamed louder than he did. Fire filled the dark. Flamethrowers, wrist charges, every weapon he had left. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. He fired until nothing moved, until the creature's breath slowed, until the silence broke. He didn't see light. He followed pain, used it like a compass. Every nerve that still hurt reminded him he was alive. He climbed through muscle that pulsed like the inside of a dying world. Acid burned through his armor, but he didn't stop. Because to stop was to disappear again. And Fett refused to vanish. He pressed his gauntlet into the wall, triggered another blast. The creature convulsed. He fell upward, a motion that made no sense, but gravity had stopped obeying rules long before he did. Then there was sand. Hot, real, blinding. He collapsed onto it. The Sarlacc exhaled behind him, a sound older than pain, a dying god sinking into itself. Boba Fett rolled onto his back, staring at the sky. 2 suns burned overhead, too bright, too cruel. He didn't raise a hand to block them. He wanted to feel the heat. He had spent so long in the dark that sunlight felt like fire. He tried to move, but his body refused. Armor cracked, flesh blistered. He tasted blood through the filters. He pulled the helmet off. The air hit like knives. The skin underneath was raw, pale, unrecognizable. The face of a man who'd been reborn through acid and fire. He didn't smile. He just breathed. Slow. Measured. The sand clung to his skin. It didn't matter. After years of suffocation, even pain felt like a gift. For a long while, he lay there, watching the suns cross each other, listening to the desert breathe. And somewhere beneath him, the Sarlacc still moved. Slow, weak, alive. It would take centuries to die. But that wasn't his concern anymore. He had already died once. The man who went into that pit wasn't the one climbing out of it. That man had armor without soul, a name without meaning, a legacy without purpose. The one lying in the sand had nothing left to prove, and that made him dangerous. He pulled himself up, inch by inch. Every movement felt like lifting a planet. The jetpack was gone, the rifle lost. Half the armor had fused to his skin. But he was still Boba Fett. Even broken, that truth felt heavier than the Beskar. He began walking, no destination, just away. The desert didn't welcome him. It tested him. Every step sank deeper. Every gust cut against open wounds. But he kept walking. Because that's what survival was. Not victory, not glory, just movement. At some point, the suns blurred. He fell again, this time into the sand, not the pit. His vision flickered. Heat shimmered into shapes. He saw his father again, standing beside him, helmet under one arm. "You made it," Jango said. Boba didn't answer. He just nodded. Because this time, he didn't need to speak to be understood. The vision faded, and in its place came silence, but not the same kind that had haunted him below. This silence was earned, peaceful, human. Hours later, shapes appeared in the distance. Tusken raiders. Their silhouettes moved against the dunes like ghosts. He didn't raise his blaster, didn't even lift his head. He had no fight left. They surrounded him quietly, spoke to each other in low tones. They could have killed him, taken his armor, left him for the wind, but they didn't. One of them knelt beside him, pressed water to his lips. It was the first kindness he'd felt in years. As the sun set, he was lifted onto a bantha. The sound of the creature's breath filled the fading air. Boba Fett closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember what it felt like to be part of the living galaxy again. He wasn't escaping the Sarlacc. He was leaving himself behind. The man who rose from the sand was not the hunter who fell. He was something quieter, something colder, something patient. And though the galaxy believed he had died, the truth was far worse. He had returned. The throne wasn't warm. It was cold, metallic, heavy. And when Boba Fett sat in it, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like silence. Bib Fortuna had begged, not with words but with the slow, stumbling cowardice of a man who had never held true power. He had grown fat in the palace halls, whispering into the ears of small criminals, pretending to be Jabba. But Fett had no need to pretend. The shot had been clean. One bolt, one death. The throne was his. But there were no cheers, no thunderous declarations, only the sound of boots echoing on ancient stone, and the distant cry of desert wind. Fennec Shand stood beside him, silent, still, watching. She didn't ask what came next, because she already knew he hadn't taken the throne for glory. He had taken it to stop running. For years, he had hunted others. Then he had hunted purpose. Now, he sat on a throne built from shadows, and wondered if stillness was just another form of death. The palace stank of decay. The servants moved like ghosts. Fear still lingered in the halls, not fear of Fett, but fear that something worse would take his place. Because the underworld didn't believe in peace. It only believed in power. And Boba Fett had never cared for either. He didn't change the flags, didn't repaint the walls. He let the throne sit in silence, because for once in his life, he wanted to hear himself think. But thinking brought memories, and memories brought pain. Every night, he saw the Tuskens, not the ones who had raided moisture farms, but the ones who had saved him, taught him, given him something no bounty ever had, a place to belong. The fire, the rituals, the language that spoke with more than words. They had welcomed him after he'd crawled out of the Sarlacc, cleaned his wounds, tested his strength, respected his silence. He had stood with them as one of their own, not as a hunter, not as a clone, just a man. And they had burned for it. The dreams came in flashes, smoke, flames, raiders in black, children screaming, the chief falling without a word, and Boba waking in his healing tank, gasping for air that no longer brought peace. He didn't speak of the dreams, not to Fennec, not to the droids, not to himself, because some wounds didn't close. Even under layers of armor and bacta, he wandered the palace at night, past the dungeons, past the archives, into rooms that hadn't seen light since Jabba choked on his own chains. He found old maps, tribute lists, smuggling routes carved into stone, secrets traded for lives. But none of it mattered, because Fett wasn't looking for riches. He was looking for meaning, and the maps didn't lead there. He sat on the throne again, hands resting on the armrests like weightless armor, eyes fixed on the empty door. They would come soon. The captains, the syndicates, the cowards who'd once called Jabba master. They would expect threats, displays, violence. But Boba Fett wasn't here to be feared. He was here to be remembered, not as a clone, not as a weapon, but as a man who chose silence over screams. He leaned back, let the echoes of the chamber settle, and for the first time since the palace had been taken, he closed his eyes and listened, not for footsteps, not for betrayal, but for the sound of himself breathing. Because for a man who had drowned in sand, who had suffocated in armor, and been swallowed by legacy, every breath was a quiet rebellion, and every quiet rebellion was a throne of its own. The sand remembered everything, every footstep, every fire, every grave. And when Boba Fett walked the edge of the Dune Sea, he didn't walk as a warlord, he walked as a ghost. The twin suns beat down harder than before, or maybe he just felt it more. Not even the armor could hide the pull of time. Not even the throne could erase the faces he'd buried. He didn't speak as he walked, didn't send guards, didn't warn Fennec, because this was something no syndicate would understand. This was something not even the Tuscans had spoken aloud. A return. The dune where they danced in firelight was gone. The wind had taken it. The markers for the fallen were buried. But he could still see it, still hear the soft drum, the slow chant, the way the warrior child had looked at him like a brother, like a father, and then flames. They had called it a massacre. He had called it betrayal. The Nikto raiders hadn't acted alone. He knew it now. The markings were staged. The attack too clean, too final. Syndicate work, coordinated, efficient, cruel, and it had worked. It had broken something in him that hadn't grown back. He knelt in the sand, placed his hand flat against it, felt the heat. He whispered nothing. There were no prayers in his language, only silence. And in that silence, the sound of armor shifting, he stood again, not as a hunter, not as a ruler, but as the last witness of a family that never should have trusted him. He had promised them protection, and brought them death. That was the truth the Dune Sea whispered back to him. When he returned to the palace, the fires burned lower. Fennec was waiting. She never asked where he went, but she watched him longer than before. There was no meeting that day, no tribute collected, no punishments handed out. Instead, Fett went to the armory, opened the old crates, touched the gear he no longer wore. Jetpacks, explosives, sniper scopes. They felt lighter now. Not because he was stronger, but because he no longer needed them to feel whole. Legacy was heavier than weapons. He sat with Fennec that night, the firelight casting long shadows across the throne room. They spoke of small things, supply routes, syndicate tensions, the outer rim, but beneath every word a question they both understood. Why rule at all? Why not leave it behind? Why not vanish again? But Boba Fett had vanished once. Into a pit, into armor, into memory. This time he had chosen to remain visible, not for power but for closure. The tribes had taught him to ride the beast, to listen, to lead. And now he ruled not a people, but a memory. The memory of a life he had never thought possible. A life that was taken. A life that still burned under his skin like twin suns in a sky that never cooled. Fennec said nothing, but she didn't leave. And sometimes, that was enough. The crime families would test him. He knew that. Blood would come. Politics would dance. Assassins would be sent. But that wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the quiet. Because the galaxy wasn't made for silence. It was made for blaster fire and broken promises. And he had chosen something else. Not peace, but endurance. Not comfort, but meaning. Not fear, but memory. And as he looked out across the dunes from his balcony, as the night winds howled like the voices of old Tuscans carried through time, he let himself remember one last thing. He had survived. Not by fighting, not by fleeing, but by finally standing still and letting the sand settle around the bones of the man he used to be. The palace no longer echoed with screams, not because the fear had left, but because the ones who screamed had been replaced with those who watched in silence. Syndicates sent messengers, the kind who spoke in veiled warnings, the kind who smiled too wide and left datapads instead of credits. Boba Fett read them all. He didn't reply. He knew their type. He had once been their weapon. The hired blade. The ghost behind a bounty. Now, they tried to treat him like a piece on their board. But he was done being moved by others. Done chasing rewards that led nowhere. Done listening to voices that only valued blood. Fennec warned him. Tensions were rising. Spice was flowing again through the Dune Sea. And someone was financing it. Someone bigger than the street scum. Someone hidden. Someone watching. Fett didn't flinch. But inside, he felt the weight again. He hadn't taken Jabba's throne to play crime lord. He didn't want wealth. Didn't want tribute. He wanted to end the cycle. The cycle that turned every planet into a battleground. Every child into a pawn. But peace came slow. And enemies came fast. The first attack wasn't loud. It wasn't a full strike. Just 2 assassins. Poison blades. Unmarked robes. Fett killed one. Fennec the other. No questions were asked. The answers were already clear. The throne was being tested. And Fett sat on it not with pride, but with the patience of someone who had seen too many kings fall screaming. At night, he slept in the Bacta tank. Not for healing, but for remembering. Each soak took him back. To the pit, to the fire, to the child watching a clone army march past him while his father cleaned a rifle. He didn't dream in color anymore. Only in sound. Blaster fire. Breathing. Sand. And sometimes, he saw Jango's face in his own reflection. Alive, then gone, then alive again. Legacy wasn't a name. It was a weight. A scar carried across generations. And Fett bore it in silence. One evening, a delegation arrived. 3 pikes, polished robes, false smiles. They offered spice roots, tribute, even loyalty. He told them no. They didn't blink, didn't argue. They just left. Fennec looked at him when the door shut. Now they'll send more than knives. He nodded. He wasn't afraid of death. He had already died once. The question now was not how he would die, but what he would stand for before the end. The palace grew quieter each day. No droids danced, no music played. Even the walls seemed to lean in, listening. Fett walked them each night, alone, like a warden haunted by the memory of prisoners who never returned. He paused by Jabba's old chamber, untouched, rotten. He let the stench remind him this throne had never belonged to a king. It had belonged to a parasite. He wasn't trying to become one. He was trying to cleanse one. And yet, the galaxy didn't want healing. It wanted hunger. He could feel it in the stars. The way old names began to surface. Crimson Dawn, Black Sunday. Even whispers of syndicate councils forming again. They didn't understand what Fett had become. They thought he was still for hire, still chasing credits, still hungry for fear. But they were wrong. He no longer hunted the way he used to. Now he hunted something else. Silence, purpose, peace in a world that fed on war. And though it made him weak in the eyes of the powerful, it made him something stronger in the eyes of those who lived in fear. A protector, not of laws, but of boundaries. Of peace bought not with credits, but with blood he no longer wanted to spill. Fennec stood by his side, but even she began to wonder how long it would last. He told her the truth. I'm not building an empire. I'm burying one. And in that quiet confession, Tatooine's dunes shifted again. The wind carried more than sand now. It carried tension, change, and the ghosts of old rulers watching from the dark. But Fett didn't flinch. He had already walked through worse. And if the syndicates wanted a war, they would find that the man they once hired had become something they never understood. A man with no fear left to give. The throne didn't creak anymore. Fett had ordered it reforged. Not to look grander, but to remove what had been left behind. The stains, the chains, the twisted seat where Jabba once fed on fear. He sat quietly, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking. Tatooine didn't kneel. It endured. Through suns, through storms, through warlords who came and vanished like shadows. And Fett, for all his strength, knew he was just another shadow to them. He didn't want temples, didn't want his name burned into stone. He wanted one thing, a world that no longer needed bounty hunters. But legacy was never given. It had to be carved, sometimes from blood, sometimes from memory. The city was quiet now. No more processions of spice runners, no more hovercarts leaking weapons. Children played again in alleys where bodies once fell. And for the first time in years, Fett walked through Mos Espa without a weapon drawn. He passed vendors who nodded but didn't cheer. They didn't worship him. They didn't fear him. They simply saw him, a man, no longer hiding behind myth, just walking, just watching. He helped an elder lift a broken wheel, watched street racers slow down at corners. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. The city was changing, and so was he. Inside the palace, Fennec stood by the window. She asked if it was enough. He didn't answer. Not right away, because enough was something he'd never known. Not as a child on Kamino, not as a clone's son, not as a hunter wrapped in armor that fit better than any skin. Eventually, he said what he meant. I'm not building something that lasts forever. I'm just giving others time to breathe. And maybe that was enough. But peace made noise of its own. Whispers came that someone was watching the outer rim. That crimson dawn had begun to move again. They weren't sending soldiers. They were sending questions, doubts, temptations. A throne like his wasn't meant to stay quiet. People expected it to roar, to command, to punish. But Fett didn't want a palace of death. He wanted silence, balance, and that silence made him a threat to those who fed on chaos. So they sent messengers, and he sent them back. Not broken, just refused. Each time, Fennec watched him more closely. She understood power, knew how fragile it was, how easily it cracked under the weight of mercy. But Fett wasn't trying to hold power. He was trying to burn it away. And when people asked what kind of ruler he was, he didn't answer. Because he wasn't a ruler. Not really. He was a man with too many ghosts and not enough time. A man who had seen too much, lost too much, killed too much, and now just wanted something still. The final straw came on a gray morning. One of his allies betrayed him, not with a blaster, not with poison, but with a whisper to the wrong ear. Credits were traded, information sold. Fett found out, quietly. He confronted the traitor with no guards, no threats, no ceremony. Just one question. Why? The man couldn't answer. Not really. He tried to talk about legacy, about fear, about what the throne was supposed to be, but Fett had already made his choice. He let the man live, banished, stripped, forgotten. Fennec asked why, and he said it without hesitation. Because fear is what built this place, and I won't rebuild it using the same tools. There was no applause, no fireworks, no celebrations in the street, just wind and dust, and the slow heartbeat of a planet trying to heal. When he returned to the throne, he didn't sit. He stood beside it, watched the stars from the balcony, and thought of Kamino, of Geonosis, of the child he used to be, watching his father fly away one last time. That boy had chased ghosts his whole life. Until now. Because now, he wasn't chasing. He was waiting. Not for war. Not for credits. Just for a moment when the galaxy no longer needed men like him. And if that moment never came, at least he'd know he didn't stop waiting for it. Not every legacy needs fire. Some just need silence. He was never supposed to have a choice. Boba Fett wasn't born. He was copied. Engineered from a perfect template. One strand of DNA pulled from a bounty hunter the Republic bought for a war they weren't ready to fight. To the Kaminoans, he was just an experiment. A request in the contract. A single, unaltered clone meant to age naturally, not for battle, not for orders. Just to live. But even that wasn't really his to decide. He was raised by the man whose face he wore. Jango Fett taught him to track, to shoot, to fly, but never how to feel, never how to grieve. Because bounty hunters don't mourn. They collect their credits and move on. So when Boba held his father's helmet on the rain-soaked platform of Tipoca City, something inside him fractured. He had no name of his own, no future planned, no one waiting for him back home. Just a voice in his head that sounded like his father's, telling him not to cry. The clones looked like him, walked like him, but they were brothers who weren't allowed to be family. Their thoughts, their instincts all programmed, all trained. He didn't belong with them, but he didn't belong anywhere else, either. And from the moment that helmet hit the floor, he understood something no child should. If he didn't become something hard, he would be broken. So he watched the Jedi, studied the war, counted every face that had anything to do with Jango's death. He wasn't planning a life. He was planning a reckoning. The galaxy didn't care that he was just a boy. It didn't see a grieving son. It saw Jango's shadow, and shadows are easy to lose in the dark. He found work, not a home. Allies, not friends. Weapons, not comfort. And by the time his voice stopped cracking, he had already earned a reputation that grown men feared. But reputation is armor. It's loud enough to keep the silence away. What it can't do is change the truth of who he was. He didn't choose his face. He didn't choose his name. He inherited a legacy that wasn't built to nurture, only to survive. Even the people who hired him whispered behind his back. They knew where he came from, knew what he represented. Some feared it, some tried to exploit it, and deep down, so did he. Because being a clone meant never knowing if the strength was his or just something built into his blood. Was his skill earned or copied? Was his rage real, or just something Jango had passed down without trying? He told himself it didn't matter, but it did. Because no matter how far he ran, how many targets he captured, how many syndicates paid him to be their silent blade, he still looked in the mirror and saw someone else. He flew the same ship, wore the same armor, carried the same voice, but that voice didn't tell him what to do anymore. So he listened to no one, took jobs for the money, but never for the cause, and never for the Republic. Because he knew how they built their army. He knew what they stole to win their war. And he never forgot that he was part of the price. The voice never left him, even when the galaxy forgot the man who carried it. Jango Fett had been many things: mercenary, Mandalorian, template. But to Boba, he was something smaller and sharper. A sound that lived between breaths. A ghost made of instructions. He remembered the rhythm of it. Short, firm, every word a command meant to save his life. Don't trust anyone. Never show your face. Always have the high ground. Simple rules. Simple lessons. But they became scripture. And when Jango died, those words didn't fade. They hardened. They became his compass, his code, his punishment. Every bounty he took was another echo of that voice guiding his hand. Every kill, another lesson completed. But what happens when the voice you follow starts to sound like guilt? Years later, when he stared into his own reflection on Slave One's viewport, it wasn't silence he heard, it was that same instruction, repeating endlessly. Survive. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a cage. Because survival isn't life. It's just the space between one battle and the next. Boba had spent his whole existence chasing ghosts he couldn't bury. He fought for credits, for armor, for control, but never for himself. Even after the Sarlacc, when the galaxy thought he was dead, that voice still lingered, buried somewhere in the acid and the dark, still whispering, still commanding, still reminding him what a Fett was supposed to be. But when he crawled out of the pit and into the desert, he began to hear something else, something quieter, something he had never allowed before, his own voice. It was rough, tired, unsure. It didn't give orders. It asked questions. What did it mean to be a clone who had outlived his father's purpose? What did it mean to wear armor that had seen more death than protection? He remembered Camino, the endless rain, the light bouncing off the water like reflections of stars that never reached the surface. That's what Jango's voice had been. A reflection, a light that guided him but never warmed him. And without realizing it, Boba had built his life around a dead man's echo. He spoke less as he aged. Not because he grew colder, but because he no longer trusted his own sound. His father's voice had always been inside his head, calm, controlled, infallible. So when Boba spoke, he heard it layered beneath his own, and he wondered which one people were really listening to. Was it him, or Jango speaking through him one last time? He tried to remember what Jango had wanted for him. Freedom, maybe. Pride. A son who could live without the weight of servitude. But what Boba became was something far different. He wasn't free. He was bound to the myth of the name he inherited. Even the Jedi had recognized it. Mace Windu had seen Jango as a tool of the war, the Jet clones as weapons, and Boba as a threat. Maybe they were all right, because sometimes when the blaster smoked and the target fell, he didn't feel regret. He felt nothing. And that nothing was the loudest sound of all. The older he grew, the quieter Jango's voice became. Until finally, one day, it was gone. He didn't know when it happened. He just knew that silence had taken its place. But instead of peace, that silence brought grief, because it meant the only person who had ever known him was truly gone. And for the first time in his life, Boba Fett wasn't following anyone's orders. Not Jango's, not the Empire's, not the galaxy's, just his own. And he didn't yet know if that was freedom or the beginning of something worse. The helmet had always been a promise, a shield, a silence no one could break. When he was young, it felt like armor against grief. No one could see the boy crying behind it. No one could ask him who he was without Jango. And for a long time, that was enough. But as the years passed, the mask became something else. Not a barrier, a boundary, between the galaxy and whatever remained of the child inside. He told himself it was for protection. That bounty hunters needed mystery to survive. That fear came from the unknown. But there were nights quiet, long, unbearable, when he realized he hadn't felt wind on his face in months. And when he finally removed the helmet, he wasn't sure if the man beneath it still looked like him. The mirror didn't help. It showed the scars, the wear, the face that belonged to every clone. And yet, none of them. What does identity mean when your face was never yours alone? He remembered once a mission gone wrong on Ord Mantell. He was injured, bleeding, cornered. A civilian tried to help him, until they saw his face, and flinched. They'd seen that face before. In clone armor, in Republic broadcasts, in funerals. They hadn't seen Boba Fett, they'd seen a ghost of a war they were trying to forget. That's what the helmet took away. Recognition, connection, any chance of being seen as anything but a shadow. But Boba didn't stop wearing it. He wore it more. Because if the galaxy only wanted him as a myth, then he'd become one. Let them fear the helmet, let them respect the silence. The man underneath? He was still trying to understand what it meant to exist. He had no homeworld, no birth date, no family name, just armor and silence, and jobs that paid well enough to forget what was missing. The more he hunted, the less he asked why. And in that forgetting, he found purpose. Not peace, just direction. But even direction can wear thin. There were times when he looked at young bounty hunters and saw in them something he never had: freedom. Freedom to choose, to fail, to live without carrying the voice of a dead father or the memory of a face shared with millions. The helmet had made him famous. It had made him feared, but it had also made him lonely. He couldn't share meals, couldn't sleep without the sound of his own breathing echoing inside the dome, couldn't laugh even if he remembered how. It was a prison built from his own grief, and he had locked himself inside it. Sometimes he wondered, if he'd taken it off sooner, would he have lived differently? Would he have known what happiness even looked like? But those questions had no answers, just more silence. Because once a mask becomes your face, taking it off doesn't bring you back. It only shows you what time has done. By the time he stood alone on Tatooine, ruling a world of sand and shadow, he no longer wore the helmet out of duty. He wore it because he didn't know how not to. Not anymore. It had become the only part of him the galaxy respected, and the only part of him he could still trust. So he kept it on, not to hide but to hold together what little remained. Not a disguise, a memory, a warning, and a weight he had learned to carry long after the war was over. He never wanted to become Jango, but everything he did pointed straight back to him. The voice, the stance, the silence between words. He copied it without thinking, mimicked it in battle, held his blaster the same way, because that was all he had. Not a role model, a memory. One that ended in screams and dust. So Boba became what was left, what the galaxy expected. Cold, efficient, unreachable. But the truth was, he didn't understand himself. Was he a legacy, or a leftover, a son, or a shadow? He'd watched Jango kill. He'd seen the way his father moved through danger like it was air. And in those moments, Boba thought strength would keep him safe too. But strength is a mask when it comes from pain, and it always breaks with time. He remembered a job on Corellia, a target with a child, young, helpless. He didn't speak to the boy. But when their eyes met, Boba felt something shift. The child looked at him like he was death. Not a man, not a bounty hunter, just death in armor. And for a moment, Boba wanted to run. Not from danger, from himself. Because the man he had become, the myth, the legend, the silent storm, wasn't who he wanted to be. It was who the galaxy had carved out of his grief. He tried to change. Later, quietly, he stopped killing when it wasn't needed, chose contracts that didn't involve blood. But by then, his name had already written its story, and stories are harder to kill than people. There were times he dreamed of walking away, of dropping the armor into the sea and living somewhere no one said Fett again. But that was fantasy, the kind children dream of. He wasn't a child anymore. He hadn't been for decades, even when he was one. So instead of running, he endured. He stayed in the armor, walked through battles, sat on thrones, but none of it healed what was broken inside. He'd see his reflection and wonder if Jango would be proud. or if he'd be ashamed. Because Boba hadn't just carried his legacy, he'd buried it under war. He had tried to be different, but the galaxy didn't want different. It wanted fire, fear, a name that ended conversations. And so Boba gave it that. He gave the galaxy what it wanted and lost pieces of himself in the trade. By the time he ruled from Jabba's old palace, he wasn't chasing reputation anymore. He was chasing peace, a quietness he'd never known. The Tuscans had shown him a glimpse, community, belonging, something beyond credits and kills. But that life had burned too, buried in flame and smoke. So he kept walking, not as Jango's son, not as a clone, just a man. One trying to outlive the choices he never got to make. And as he stood in the silence of his own hall, the mask resting beside him, he whispered a truth no one else would ever hear. I wasn't made for this. I just survived it. And in that whisper, he found something he hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but honesty. He had tried not to become the man his enemies feared. He had tried not to disappear inside the armor. But in the end, he had become someone else entirely. Someone quieter, stronger, still afraid, but no longer pretending. And sometimes, that was enough. The galaxy moved on without him. Empires rose and fell. New wars burned across systems he once hunted through. And somewhere in the outer rim, silence followed his name. Not because he was forgotten, but because people didn't know how to speak of him. Boba Fett was never meant to be a symbol. He wasn't forged in prophecy or prophecy's ruins. He didn't carry sabers made of light. He wasn't chosen by the Force. He was built from loss, trained by violence, and buried under legend. After the Sarlacc, whispers said he died. Others said he lived changed, slower, quieter. But few knew the truth, and fewer dared ask. Because something about Boba felt final, like a closing door, like a story that ended before it was told. Even among bounty hunters, he was different. He didn't brag, didn't explain, didn't chase fear. He let it settle naturally in the silence that followed his steps. And when he vanished again, there was no broadcast, no funeral, no monument, just a space where he used to be. Some said he left the palace. Others believed he stayed, hidden in the sands of Tatooine, living among ghosts. Not the kind that haunted, but the kind that watched. He had nothing left to prove. He'd outlived war, betrayal, the Empire, and himself. Because after a certain point, Boba Fett stopped chasing fate. He started observing it, letting the galaxy bend around him while he remained still. And in that stillness, he found something rare, not peace, not purpose, but distance. Enough distance to see what he had become, and what he never wanted to be. He never asked for power. He never believed in destiny. He wore the armor because it protected the boy underneath, not because it defined the man. And when that armor no longer fit the world he walked in, he didn't take it off. He just stopped needing it to speak for him. Because legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It lingers in the choices no one saw, in the lives spared, in the moments left unclaimed. Boba Fett's name faded from headlines, but not from memory. The right people remembered. The ones who'd faced him. The ones who'd heard the calm in his voice before the shot. The ones who'd seen that under the helmet, he was never a machine. He was always a man. And in a galaxy obsessed with heroes and monsters, that was easy to overlook. But not by those who understood. Because the silence he left behind was louder than anything he ever said. There was a time when his name could have meant something more. Not just fear, not just skill, but legacy. He could have taken the Darksaber, could have challenged the clans, could have stood on Mandalore's broken ground and claimed a throne no one else dared approach. But Boba Fett walked away from all of it. Not because he wasn't Mandalorian, but because he never believed in crowns. He was the son of a foundling, raised not by creed, but by a man who built his life outside it. Jango Fett wasn't a traditional Mandalorian, and neither was Boba. To the clans, he was a copy, a clone, a weapon manufactured in the image of a warrior they barely trusted. But legacy doesn't care about blood. It cares about choice, and every choice Boba made pulled him further from the throne he never asked for. He wore the armor. He spoke the language of survival. He understood honor, but he didn't want followers, didn't need a tribe. He had seen what power did to those who reached for it, what titles did to those who thought they deserved them. He didn't want to rule Mandalore. He didn't want to restore it. He wanted to outlive it, because to him, the culture wasn't in temples or banners. It was in silence, in memory, in how you stood when no one was looking. That was why he never corrected the rumors, never fought for recognition. Let others chase the darksaber. Let others gather the clans. He had already buried enough dreams. He wasn't about to dig up another one just to sit on a throne made of broken promises. Still, some called him Mandalore, quietly, with respect, not because he demanded it, but because he never had to. There were warriors who would have followed him, who saw the way he stood alone and still walked forward. But he didn't lead. He watched. Watched as others tried to rebuild something long shattered. Watched as Mandalore fell and rose and fell again. He didn't interfere, because some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some things are meant to be remembered. He carried his father's armor, his scars, his solitude, and to some, that was enough. Not the Mandalore of legend, not the leader they needed, but maybe the one who reminded them what it meant to survive. Because survival was the only crown Boba Fett ever wore, and it didn't shine. It endured. He walked alone, but every step echoed in a history that never made room for him. And still, he never stopped walking. Tatooine didn't speak his name, but it remembered his silence. Long after Jabba's palace fell quiet, long after the syndicates shifted like sand, there were stories whispered in alleys and campfires, not about what he did, but how he stood, still, alone. The desert had taken many things from him, blood, time, even his body, but it gave him something, too: clarity, stillness, a chance to listen to what remained inside the armor. He had no heirs, no clan, no monument, but his presence lingered like the heat in the rocks, undeniable, unspoken. The Jawas remembered his broken shell, the Tuscans remembered his scars, and the city folk, even the ones who never saw his face, felt a weight pass through the streets when he walked by. He didn't seek tribute, didn't demand respect. He simply existed. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. Some say legacy is carved in stone, in statues, in songs. But Boba Fett's legacy was carved in pause, in the hush that followed his name. Even the people he spared never forgot, because mercy, from him, felt heavier than violence. He had become a myth, not the kind that shouted, the kind that haunted. And maybe that's why the sand never buried him, because it recognized what he was. Not a king, not a savior, just a man who refused to be erased. He didn't erase his past, didn't clean the blood from his hands. He just stopped pretending it was all he was. Every bounty, every betrayal, every silent night inside the helmet, they all lived in him still. But now, he let them pass. Like wind, like dust. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of the dune sea, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes closed against the sun, not watching, not waiting, just breathing. as if he'd finally stopped chasing the life he thought he needed, and started living the one he had. There were no more empires to serve, no more clients to please, no more clones to outrun, only the wind, only the silence, only the story still unfolding in every footstep he left behind. He never said goodbye, never claimed to be done, but those who passed through Tatooine after him swore they could feel it, a presence that never spoke, but always watched, a shadow that didn't threaten, only remembered, because even when the armor was empty, the myth remained full, not of fire, but of stillness. He didn't need to be seen. He only needed to be felt, and in that quiet, his legacy whispered louder than any throne. The galaxy moved on, new wars, new weapons, new names to fear, but somewhere beneath it all, his shadow still lingered. In the corners of bounty boards, his name still appeared not as a current threat, but as a question no one could answer. Did he survive? Did he disappear? Did he ever take the helmet off for good? No one could say. And maybe that was the point, because his story didn't end with a blaze of glory. It didn't ask for attention. It didn't want applause. It faded, slowly, like a man walking into a horizon that never quite ends. But that quiet ending carried more weight than most battles, because it made people wonder. What does it mean to survive everything? To live long enough that your legend forgets to include your name? He had walked through fire, bled across galaxies, outlived clones, Sith, empires. And in the end, he didn't leave a legacy of destruction. He left a question. Was Boba Fett a killer who learned to feel, or a child who learned to hide behind steel? The answer, like him, was never clear. He had no farewell, no body laid to rest, no grave carved in stone. Only the rusting hull of Jabba's throne. Only the silence of Mos Espa's streets. Only the whisper of his name, still spoken by those too afraid to speak it loud. And sometimes, that's all it takes for a myth to live forever. Not fear, not blood, but uncertainty. The not knowing. The wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting, deciding if he'll return. Some say he died on Tatooine. Others say he became something else entirely. But those who knew him really knew him, understood the truth. He didn't seek vengeance anymore. He didn't chase credits. He didn't wear the armor to scare people. He wore it to remember the boy who watched his father die. To remember the silence that followed. To remember that legacy, true legacy, was not in who you killed, but in who you protected. And so, his story ends not with fire, but with stillness. Not with screams, but with wind. A wind that carries the weight of all. He was the hunter, the orphan, the survivor, the myth. And somewhere, in some far corner of the outer rim, a ship rests, untouched, covered in dust. Inside it, a helmet sits in silence. And maybe that's where he left it, or maybe he still wears it. No one knows. And that is how it should be. Because Boba Fett's greatest power was never his blaster, or his armor, or his fear. It was the silence he left behind. A silence so heavy it still echoes. Even when the man is gone, even when the legend stays.